Wyoming Territory, 1871. The winter had withdrawn its claws from the land, leaving behind a cautious spring that painted the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains with hesitant strokes of green and gold. It was in this season of rebirth that Zeke Harrington rode into Clearwater Valley, a man whose faith in humanity had been buried alongside too many friends in unmarked graves across the frontier. At 25, Zeke had already lived several lifetimes, each one harder than the last. The war between the states had taken his youth, and the lawless years that followed had hardened the rest of him into something unyielding. His face, though handsome with its strong jawline and piercing blue eyes, rarely softened into anything resembling warmth. The light stubble that shadowed his sun-bronzed skin did little to hide the scar that ran along his left jaw, a permanent reminder of a knife fight in Dodge City that he'd barely survived. "No attachments," he muttered to his dun-colored gelding as they crested the ridge overlooking the sprawling valley below. "That's how you stay alive out here." The horse flicked its ears back, perhaps the only creature that had heard Zeke speak more than 10 words at a time in the past year. Zeke had come to Wyoming with a singular purpose: to earn enough money to buy a small plot of land in Oregon Territory, far from civilization and the complications that came with it. The open-range cattle business was booming, and a man with his skills could command good wages. He needed just one more season, maybe two, and then he could disappear for good. What he didn't need were connections, friendships, or, God forbid, a woman to cloud his judgment. The frontier had taught him one lesson above all others: those who formed attachments suffered the most when the unforgiving West inevitably tore them apart. Better to remain alone, unburdened, ready to move on when trouble found you, as it always did. Below him sprawled the vast Valerian Ranch, one of the largest spreads in the territory. He'd heard they were hiring experienced hands for the spring roundup. The ranch house and outbuildings looked orderly and well-maintained from his vantage point, a promising sign. Maybe here he could earn his stake quickly and move on before anyone got close enough to see the hollowness behind his eyes. As Zeke rode down into the valley, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land. He wasn't looking for redemption or healing. He was looking for work, nothing more, but the frontier had never cared much for a man's plans. Daisy Valerian had spent her entire 19 years on her father's ranch, but the vastness of Wyoming Territory still took her breath away when she paused to truly look at it. She stood on the porch of the ranch house, her honey-blonde hair escaping its practical braid as the spring breeze tugged at the wayward strands. Her simple blue cotton dress, practical yet feminine with its modest lace collar, fluttered against her slender frame. "Papa, the south pasture fence still needs mending before we can move the new calves," she called through the open door. "Johnson says he'll get to it tomorrow, but I don't think it can wait that long." Inside, Harold Valerian grunted in acknowledgement, too absorbed in his ledgers to give a proper response. Since Daisy's mother had passed 5 winters ago, the running of the household had fallen to her, and increasingly, much of the ranch management as well. Her father was a good rancher, but had little head for the details that kept an operation of their size functioning. Not that anyone beyond the ranch hands knew of Daisy's involvement. In town, she was just poor motherless Daisy Valerian, or Old Valerian's plain daughter. Never mind that she could ride as well as any cowhand, knew cattle better than most men twice her age, and had a head for numbers that kept the ranch solvent through the harsh winters when other spreads faltered. "I'll see to it myself then," she muttered, reaching for her riding gloves. She didn't resent the work. She loved this land with a fierceness that sometimes frightened her. What she resented was the invisibility of her contributions, the way her father's occasional visitors would pat her hand and ask when she planned to find a husband, as though her entire existence was merely a waiting room before real life began. As she stepped off the porch, she spotted a rider approaching from the north ridge. The way he sat his horse marked him as experienced, a cowhand looking for work, no doubt. They were short-staffed after losing 3 men to better-paying outfits over the winter. Daisy straightened her spine and lifted her chin. She might not be acknowledged beyond these acres, but here, she was as much the heart of the Valerian Ranch as her father, and she would be treated accordingly. Zeke noticed the young woman watching his approach long before he reached the ranch yard. Something about her posture, straight-backed and steady, told him she wasn't just a rancher's wife or daughter waiting to direct him to the men. She stood her ground as he rode up, neither retreating to the safety of the house nor calling for a man to handle his arrival. He removed his hat as he reined his horse to a stop, offering the barest nod of acknowledgement. "Afternoon, ma'am, I'm looking for work. Heard the Valerian spread might be hiring." Up close her eyes surprised him, a clear, intelligent green that assessed him with unsettling directness. Not the timid glance he was accustomed to from frontier women when faced with a stranger. "We might be," she replied, her voice steady and unrushed. "Depends on your skills. Can you rope, ride, and work cattle?" Zeke blinked, momentarily thrown by her directness. "Yes, ma'am, done it since I was 12, worked spreads in Texas, Kansas, and Colorado." "And can you follow orders, Mr. Harrington?" "Zeke Harrington. And yes, I follow orders just fine when they make sense." A slight smile touched her lips. "An honest answer at least. I'm Daisy Valerian. My father owns this ranch. He makes the final decisions on hiring, but he trusts my judgment." Something in her tone suggested this last part might not be entirely true, but she continued smoothly. "We've got roundup starting in a week. Pay is $40 a month plus found. Season runs through October." Zeke nodded. The wage was fair and 6 months would put him close to his goal. "That'll do. You'll bunk in the hands' quarters. Meals are in the cookhouse. No drinking on the property, no fighting, and Sunday is for rest unless there's an emergency." She gestured toward a cluster of buildings. "Stable your horse and see Winslow at the cookhouse. He'll show you where to put your gear." As she turned to leave, Zeke found himself asking, "You always handle the hiring, Miss Valerian?" She paused, those green eyes finding his again. "I handle what needs handling, Mr. Harrington. On the Valerian Ranch, we all do what's needed, not just what's expected." With that, she walked away, her posture never faltering. Zeke watched her go, an unfamiliar sensation prickling at the back of his neck. It felt dangerously close to curiosity, a luxury he hadn't permitted himself in years. Shaking it off, he led his horse toward the stable. He wasn't here to unravel the mysteries of Harold Valerian's daughter. He was here to work, earn his stake, and move on, just like always. The first week at the Valerian Ranch passed in a blur of hard work, as the hands prepared for the spring roundup. Zeke kept to himself, speaking only when necessary and disappearing into the bunkhouse after supper, while the other men played cards or swapped increasingly outlandish tales. He worked harder than most, taking on the difficult tasks without complaint, pushing himself until exhaustion guaranteed dreamless sleep. It was during the roundup preparations that he began to notice something unusual about the Valerian operation. Unlike other ranches he'd worked, where the owner's word was law and the foreman merely enforced it, the Valerian Ranch seemed to operate under a different system. Harold Valerian, a gruff man in his 50s with a perpetually distracted air, appeared only occasionally to give vague directives before retreating to the main house. The real authority lay elsewhere, though it wasn't immediately obvious. Johnson, the foreman, gave orders, but Zeke often observed him conferring with Daisy Valerian beforehand. She was everywhere, checking cattle, inspecting fences, reviewing supply inventories, always with quiet competence that the hands seemed to respect without acknowledging. On the 5th day, Zeke found himself assigned to help repair the south pasture fence, the same one he'd overheard Daisy mention on his first day. Johnson paired him with an older hand named Cooper, a taciturn man with a graying beard and hands gnarled from decades of ranch work. "Miss Daisy says this section won't hold the new calves," Cooper explained as they loaded fence posts onto the wagon. "Says we need to sink the posts deeper and double the wire." Zeke raised an eyebrow. "She knows a lot about fence building." Cooper gave him a measured look. "Miss Daisy knows more about ranching than most men who have been doing it their whole lives. She just can't let folks know it." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Her pa's a good man, but since her ma died, he's lost his direction. Miss Daisy's the only reason this place is still turning a profit." Zeke absorbed this information silently as they worked through the morning. Around midday, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look up. Daisy rode toward them on a spirited chestnut mare, her riding skirt and simple white blouse a practical concession to the work she was doing. Her honey-blonde hair was secured in a practical braid that hung down her back, though tendrils had escaped to frame her face in the spring breeze. "Cooper, Mr. Harrington," she greeted them, dismounting with practiced ease. "How is the repair coming along?" "On schedule, Miss Daisy," Cooper reported. "Should be sturdy enough to hold back a stampede when we're done." She nodded, then walked the length of their completed section, examining the fence posts and testing the wire tension with gloved hands. Zeke watched her, noting the confidence in her movements and the knowledge in her assessment. "Sink this post another 6 inches," she said, pointing to one that Zeke had just set. "The ground's softer here. It won't hold during the spring rains." Zeke bristled slightly at the criticism of his work, then caught himself. She was right, he'd noticed the same thing but had decided it was sufficient. "Yes, ma'am," he said, already moving to correct it. She watched him for a moment, then turned to Cooper. "I've brought lunch from Mrs. Peterson. There's coffee in the pot on my saddle." As they ate the simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried beef, Daisy remained with them, asking Cooper about his wife's health and discussing the condition of the spring calves. Zeke ate in silence, observing the easy rapport between them. "You're quiet, Mr. Harrington," Daisy said suddenly, turning her attention to him. "Johnson says you're a hard worker, but you don't say much. Where were you before Wyoming?" "Colorado, before that Kansas." He offered nothing more, hoping she would return to her conversation with Cooper. "And before that," she persisted, "your accent suggests Texas, perhaps." Zeke met her gaze, surprised by her perception. "Born there, left after the war." "Which side?" The question was direct, without judgment. "Confederate at first, switched to Union in '63. He didn't explain further how he'd enlisted at 17, believing in a cause he barely understood, then deserted after Vicksburg when the horror of what he was fighting for became clear. How he'd made his way north and re-enlisted under a different name, fighting to end the very thing he'd once defended. Something in Daisy's expression softened. That couldn't have been an easy choice. "No choices are easy in war." The words came out harsher than he intended. An awkward silence fell until Cooper cleared his throat. "Miss Daisy's brother fought for the Union, never came home." Zeke glanced at Daisy, seeing a flash of old pain cross her face before she composed herself. "Thomas was 20 when he left," she said quietly. "He wrote to me about a Texan in his unit who could ride anything with 4 legs and taught the entire company to rope. I always wondered if that man made it home." The simple story, laden with unspoken grief, pierced something in Zeke that he thought had calloused over years ago. He looked away, uncomfortable with the unwelcome empathy. "Lot of good men didn't come back." Daisy studied him for a moment longer, then stood, brushing crumbs from her riding skirt. "I should get back. The cattle buyer is coming this afternoon." She mounted her horse with graceful efficiency. "Make sure that fence is done by sundown. We're moving the calves at first light." As she rode away, Cooper chuckled softly. "She's got your measure, Harrington." "What's that supposed to mean?" Zeke asked, already returning to the fence post. "Means she sees more than most, always has." Cooper rose stiffly, gathering the remains of their meal. "And she doesn't waste time on men she thinks aren't worth it." Zeke hammered the post with more force than necessary, driving it deep into the Wyoming soil. "I'm not looking to be worth anyone's time, Cooper. I'm just here to earn my wage." The older man shrugged. "Ain't we all? But sometimes life has other plans." He picked up the wire stretcher. "Now help me with this section. Miss Daisy wants it done by sundown, and I'm not about to disappoint her." The spring roundup began with the first hint of dawn, the ranch hands riding out in teams to gather the Valerian cattle scattered across the vast rangeland. Zeke found himself paired with a young hand named Riley, barely 20 and eager to prove himself. They were assigned the northwestern section, a rough area of broken hills and small ravines where cattle often concealed themselves. "Johnson says you're good at finding strays," Riley commented as they rode out, the rising sun painting the landscape in shades of pink and gold. Said that's why he paired me with you. I tend to miss the crafty ones. Zeke merely nodded, his eyes already scanning the terrain. Tracking was one of his skills, honed first by necessity during the war, then refined during his years drifting across the West. He could read sign that others missed, understanding the habits of animals and men alike. It was a talent that had kept him alive, though it had never brought him any particular satisfaction. They worked steadily through the morning, flushing cattle from hidden draws and urging them toward the central gathering point. Riley chattered intermittently, seemingly undeterred by Zeke's minimal responses. By midday, they had gathered a respectable number of cattle, including several crafty old cows that had evaded last year's roundup entirely. "We should head southeast now," Zeke said as they paused to water their horses at a small creek. "There's likely more in that stand of cottonwoods near the boundary fence." Riley took a long drink from his canteen. "That's Blackwood land beyond the fence. They don't take kindly to Valerian hands crossing over, even by accident. Trouble between the ranches. Old trouble, Mr. Valerian and Eli Hoffman. He owns the Hoffman Ranch next door, have been feuding for years over water rights to Silver Creek. Got worse after Mrs. Valerian died. There was talk she and Hoffman were sweet on each other before she married Valerian." Riley lowered his voice, though there was no one to overhear. "Some say that's why Miss Daisy doesn't have any suitors. The good families in town don't want to get caught between the feud, and her pa scares off the rest." Zeke absorbed this information silently. Ranch feuds were common enough in the territories, usually ending in bloodshed sooner or later. He'd hoped to avoid such complications, but it seemed the Valerian Ranch had its share of troubles despite its prosperity. "We'll stay clear of the boundary," he said finally, mounting his horse. "But I still think there are cattle in those trees." They approached the cottonwood stand cautiously. As Zeke had predicted, they found nearly a dozen Valerian cattle sheltering in the shade. As they began to drive them out, a gunshot cracked overhead, sending birds scattering from the trees. "That's far enough," a voice called from across the nearby fence line. Two riders appeared, rifles raised. "Those cattle crossed onto Hoffman land, they're forfeit now." Riley paled, his hand instinctively moving toward his own sidearm. Zeke gave him a sharp look, shaking his head in warning. "They're on Valerian land now," Zeke called back calmly, "and they're wearing Valerian brands. We're just doing our job." "Your job don't concern me, stranger," the older of the two men sneered. He was heavyset with a bushy beard and small, mean eyes. "This here's the third time this month Valerian stock has wandered onto Hoffman grass. Mr. Hoffman says we're keeping any strays we find." Zeke assessed the situation rapidly. The men were itching for confrontation, positioned with the sun at their backs to disadvantage anyone looking their way. A deliberate tactic. This wasn't a chance encounter, they'd been waiting. "Riley," he said quietly, "ride back and tell Johnson what's happening. Tell him I said it's a setup." "I can't leave you." "Go now." Zeke's tone left no room for argument. As Riley reluctantly turned his horse, Zeke called to the Hoffman men, the boys riding for help. "Anything happens to me or these cattle, you'll have the whole Valerian crew down on you within the hour." The older man spat. "Hiding behind a girl and her crippled pa now. Valerian can't even fight his own battles anymore." Zeke kept his expression neutral, though the insult to Daisy made something tighten in his chest. "Just doing the job I was hired for. These cattle go back with me." A tense silence stretched between them. Then, unexpectedly, hoofbeats approached from the direction of the Valerian Ranch. All heads turned to see Daisy herself galloping toward them, her blonde hair streaming behind her as she rode astride like a man rather than side saddle. She reined her horse to a stop beside Zeke, slightly breathless but composed. "Curtis," she addressed the older Hoffman hand, "I see you're still trying to provoke a war over a few stray cattle. Does Mr. Hoffman know you're out here making threats on his behalf?" Curtis shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Valerian, this ain't proper business for a young lady." Neither is cattle rustling proper business for men claiming to be honest ranch hands, she replied sharply. Those are Valerian cattle on Valerian land. Or would you like me to ride to town right now and ask the sheriff to come survey the boundary markers again? The mention of the sheriff caused visible discomfort. Curtis exchanged glances with his companion before lowering his rifle reluctantly. We'll be watching the boundary, he warned. Next time your cattle wander over, they'll stay wandered. There won't be a next time, Daisy assured him with steel in her voice. Mr. Harrington here will be reinforcing our boundary fences next week, won't you, Mr. Harrington? Zeke nodded, keeping his eyes on the Hoffman men as they turned their horses and rode away, disappearing over a rise. When they were gone, Daisy's shoulders slumped slightly, the only indication that the confrontation had affected her. Are you all right? Riley came flying into the ranch yard, saying there was going to be a shooting. No danger of that, Zeke replied, though he wasn't entirely convinced. The Hoffman hands had been looking for trouble. How did you get here so fast? I was already riding out to check on the roundup teams. She surveyed the cattle they'd gathered. You found old Bessie, I see. She's escaped the last 2 roundups. Zeke looked at her with new appreciation. You know your cattle by sight. A small smile touched her lips. The troublemakers, yes. Rather like people, the ones that cause problems tend to be memorable. Her eyes met his, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them, a flash of understanding, perhaps even respect. Then she turned her horse. We should get these cattle to the main herd, and Mr. Harrington. Yes, Miss Valerian. Thank you for not escalating the situation. Some men would have felt compelled to prove something. Before he could respond, she urged her horse forward, guiding the reluctant cattle out from the cottonwood shade. Zeke watched her for a moment, struck by the natural authority she commanded despite her youth and gender. She sat her horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle, handling the cattle with practiced skill. As he rode to join her, Zeke felt a troubling realization forming. For the first time in years, he was genuinely curious about another person, wondering what forces had shaped Daisy Valerian into this unusual woman who seemed to belong to the frontier in a way few did. It was a dangerous path of thinking for a man determined to remain unattached, yet he couldn't seem to redirect his thoughts. He told himself it was merely respect for a capable ranch manager, nothing more. But even as he thought it, he knew the lie for what it was. The days of roundup blurred together in an exhausting routine of early mornings, long rides, and late evenings. The Valerian hands worked well together despite the grueling pace, with Johnson coordinating the various teams efficiently. To Zeke's surprise, Daisy was frequently in the thick of the work, riding out with different groups each day, helping with the cattle counts and inspecting the calves for branding. A week into the roundup, Zeke found himself assigned to the branding corral, a hot, dusty job that required quick reflexes and seamless coordination. He worked the ropes, lassoing calves and dragging them to the branding fire where other hands held them down for the hot iron. It was punishing work, but Zeke preferred it to some of the other assignments. The physical demands left no room for thought. Around midday, he noticed Daisy approaching the corral. She had exchanged her usual riding skirt for canvas trousers, shocking attire for a woman, but practical for ranch work. Her hair was tied back beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her face flushed from the heat but determined. Johnson, she called to the foreman, I'll spell Roper for a while. He needs to see to his hand. She nodded toward one of the younger hands who had been helping hold the calves. His palm was wrapped in a bloody bandana where a rope burn had torn open. Johnson hesitated. Miss Daisy, your pa wouldn't like. My father is in town today, she interrupted firmly. And we need to finish this section before sundown. I've done it before. Without waiting for further protest, she stepped into the corral, taking the position Roper vacated. Zeke watched with skepticism as she knelt in the dust, ready to help hold the next calf. Branding was brutal work, hot, dangerous, and requiring considerable strength to control panicked animals. He roped the next calf, a particularly vigorous specimen that fought the rope with every step. As he dragged it toward the branding fire, he found himself hesitating, concerned that Daisy wouldn't be able to handle the animal's strength. She looked up, catching his hesitation. "I won't break, mister." "Harrington," she called, a challenge in her green eyes. "Bring him over." Chastened, Zeke pulled the calf to the branding area. Daisy moved with practiced efficiency, grabbing the calf's rear legs and twisting it onto its side while Cooper secured the front. Her movements were precise and confident, showing years of experience that belied her age and gender. For the next hour, they worked in seamless coordination. Zeke brought calf after calf, and Daisy never faltered, her strength and endurance matching the men working alongside her. Her hands, though smaller, were just as capable, and she never complained about the heat, dust, or the inevitable kicks and struggles from the frightened animals. During a brief water break, Zeke found himself standing beside her at the barrel. "You've done this before," he observed, not a question but an acknowledgement. She took a long drink before answering. "Since I was 14, my mother died that winter. Thomas was already gone to war. Someone had to help." She flexed her hands, which despite their feminine shape were calloused and strong. "The hands didn't like it at first, a girl in the branding corral, but I proved myself." "Your father allowed it." A shadow crossed her face. "My father withdrew after my mother died. He managed the big decisions but left the daily running to Johnson. And Johnson quickly learned I could do the work." She looked at Zeke directly. "Does it bother you, taking orders from a woman?" The question was blunt, challenging. Zeke considered it honestly. "No," he said finally. "I've known capable women before. The frontier doesn't care much about what's proper, only what works." Something in her expression softened, a brief glimpse of the young woman beneath the competent ranch manager. "That's a surprisingly progressive view, Mr. Harrington." "Not progressive, practical." He took another drink of water. "You know cattle in this land. That matters more than whether you wear trousers or a dress while doing it." A small smile touched her lips. "Well, perhaps you're not as rigid as you first appeared." Before he could respond, she set down her cup and turned back to the corral. "Break's over. We still have 50 calves to brand before sunset." As they returned to work, Zeke found himself watching Daisy with new awareness. Not just as his employer's daughter or even as a surprisingly capable rancher, but as a woman who had carved out her own place in a world that offered few options to her sex. It was impressive and dangerous to notice. The sun beat down mercilessly as the afternoon wore on, but Daisy never slowed or complained. When one particularly large calf broke loose from Cooper's grip and nearly escaped, it was Daisy who lunged forward, tackling it with a determination that left even the seasoned hands shaking their heads in admiration. As she stood brushing dust from her trousers, her eyes met Zeke's across the corral. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Two people who did what needed doing, regardless of convention or expectation. Zeke quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the connection. He wasn't here to form attachments, especially not to the boss's daughter. He had a plan. Work hard, earn his stake, move on. Nothing had changed. Yet as the branding continued through the hot afternoon, he found his gaze returning to Daisy Valerian again and again, watching the competent movements of her hands, the determined set of her jaw, the occasional flash of humor in her green eyes when something amused her. And each time he reminded himself more firmly, he was just passing through. The frontier had no place for permanence or connection. Those who forgot that lesson paid with their hearts or sometimes their lives. That evening, after a hearty supper in the cookhouse, most of the hands gathered around the fire outside to ease their aching muscles and share stories before turning in. Zeke, as was his habit, ate quickly and prepared to retreat to the solitude of the bunkhouse. "Harrington," Johnson called as he rose from the table, "stay a minute. Miss Daisy asked me to send you to the main house after supper. Says she wants to discuss the boundary fence repairs." Surprised and slightly wary, Zeke nodded. He made his way across the ranch yard to the substantial two-story house that stood as the center of the Valerian operation. It was a handsome structure, built of solid timber with a wide wraparound porch, far more substantial than most ranch houses in the territory, speaking to the Valerians' relative prosperity. He removed his hat as he climbed the steps, uncomfortably aware of the dust and sweat of the day's labor still clinging to him. Before he could knock, the door opened to reveal Daisy, now dressed in a simple blue dress, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders. The transformation from the capable rancher in trousers to this more conventionally feminine appearance was striking, though her direct gaze remained unchanged. "Mr. Harrington, thank you for coming. Please come in." She stepped aside to allow him entry into a comfortable front parlor. "Can I offer you coffee, or perhaps something stronger? You've had a long day." "Coffee is fine, thank you," he replied, standing awkwardly in the center of the room, his hat in his hands. The domestic setting felt foreign after so many years of bunkhouses and saloons. "Please sit down." She gestured to a sturdy armchair near the fireplace, where a small blaze took the evening chill from the air. As she moved to pour coffee from a pot kept warm on the hearth, Zeke noticed she still moved with the same efficient grace she'd shown in the branding corral. "Is your father joining us?" he asked, glancing around the empty parlor. "No, he's still in town, business with the bank." She handed him a cup of strong black coffee. "Actually, that's partly why I asked you here. Johnson tells me you've worked on boundary fences before, particularly in disputed areas." Zeke nodded cautiously. In Texas, after the war, some operations were trying to expand their territory while smaller ranchers were still rebuilding. "That's similar to our situation with the Hoffman Ranch." She sat across from him, her posture straight but not rigid. "The boundary has been clearly marked and legally documented for years, but since my brother's death and my mother's passing, Eli Hoffman has been pushing his cattle closer and closer to the line, sometimes crossing over entirely." "And your father?" A shadow crossed her face. "My father hasn't been the same since we lost Thomas and Mother. He focuses on the ledgers and the cattle contracts, but the day-to-day operations." She straightened, as if catching herself revealing too much. "In any case, after today's incident, I believe we need to reinforce our boundary fence immediately, not wait until after Roundup as we'd planned." "You want me to organize it?" "Yes. Johnson speaks highly of your work, and I saw today that you're not afraid of confrontation but know how to avoid escalating it." She met his gaze directly. "That's a rare quality, Mr. Harrington. Most men I've known tend toward one extreme or the other, either avoiding conflict entirely or rushing headlong into it." The assessment was surprisingly astute, and Zeke found himself uncomfortable with her perception. "I can handle the fence," he said, steering back to practical matters. "But it won't stop their hands from causing trouble if that's what Hoffman wants." "No, but it will make it harder for them to claim our cattle, wandered, onto their land. And it sends a message that we're not weakening." She sipped her coffee, her expression thoughtful. "I'd like you to select 2 men to help you. The work should start day after tomorrow." "All right," he hesitated, then asked the question that had been bothering him since the confrontation at the boundary. "Miss Valerian, is there more to this feud than just water rights? The Hoffman hand mentioned your father, and implied things about you." Daisy's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her cup. "Frontier gossip, Mr. Harrington. Surely you've encountered it before." When he remained silent, waiting, she sighed softly. "Eli Hoffman courted my mother before she married my father. Some say he never forgave either of them for her choice. After she died, the old grievance seemed to resurface. And the comments about you." A flush touched her cheeks, though whether from anger or embarrassment Zeke couldn't tell. "Hoffman has a son, Victor. 28, ambitious and by all accounts as ruthless as his father. There was an understanding that Victor and I might make a match, thus resolving the feud. I declined." "Declined?" Zeke raised an eyebrow, suspecting there was more to the story. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I may have declined by dumping a glass of punch over Victor's head at last year's Founders' Day dance when he suggested that once we were married, I would no longer need to concern myself with men's work on the ranch." Despite himself, Zeke felt a smile tugging at his own mouth. The image of proper Miss Valerian dousing an unwanted suitor was surprisingly satisfying. I imagine that didn't improve relations between the ranches. No, it did not. Her green eyes sparked with a mixture of defiance and humor. Victor Hoffman believes every woman is simply waiting for a man to tell her what her place should be. I disagreed with his assessment. Understandably, Zeke found himself genuinely curious. Do you not want to marry, then? The directness of the question seemed to surprise her, but she considered it thoughtfully. I want what my parents had, a partnership of equals. My father never treated my mother as less because she was a woman. They built this ranch together. She looked around the comfortable room, her expression softening with memory. I won't settle for less than that respect, Mr. Harrington, and in this territory, that seems to limit my options considerably. The honest answer touched something in Zeke that he'd thought long buried. A recognition of shared values, perhaps, or simply appreciation for her forthright nature. That's admirable, he said finally, uncomfortable with the unexpected intimacy of the conversation. Sensing his discomfort, Daisy rose smoothly. I've kept you too long after such a hard day's work. We can discuss the specifics of the fence repair tomorrow. She moved toward the door, signaling the end of their meeting. Thank you for your candor, Mr. Harrington. It's refreshing. As Zeke stepped back onto the porch, he paused, compelled by an unfamiliar urge to continue their conversation. Miss Valerian, he said, turning back to her, for what it's worth, I think your brother would be proud of how you've kept the ranch going. The simple statement clearly caught her off guard. For a moment her composed facade faltered, revealing a flash of vulnerability that made her seem younger, more accessible. Thank you, she said softly. That means a great deal. Zeke nodded once, then descended the steps, crossing the darkened ranch yard toward the bunkhouse. Behind him, the warm light from the Valerian house spilled onto the porch, a beacon of domesticity in the vast wilderness of the territory. For the first time in years he felt the sharp sting of loneliness, not the solitary existence he had deliberately chosen, but a true ache for connection. It was unwelcome, this feeling, dangerous. He quickened his pace as if he could outrun the unwanted emotion. He had come to Wyoming for work, not entanglement. Nothing had changed. Nothing could change. Yet as he entered the bunkhouse and found his narrow cot, he knew something fundamental had shifted inside him. The careful walls he had built around his heart had developed a crack, small perhaps, but present. And as any rancher knew, once a fence showed weakness, it was only a matter of time before something broke through. The boundary fence project began 2 days later with Zeke and 2 hands he'd selected, Cooper, and a steady, quiet man named Erickson. They loaded a wagon with fence posts, wire, and tools, setting out at dawn for the southeastern boundary that separated Valerian land from the Hoffman Ranch. The existing fence was in poor condition, with rotted posts and sagging wire that would barely contain determined cattle. Zeke could see why Daisy had been concerned. It practically invited incursions from either side, deliberate or otherwise. We'll replace every 3rd post and run double wire along the entire section, Zeke instructed as they surveyed the damage. Cooper, you start digging out the old posts. Erickson, measure and cut the wire. I'll handle the new post placement. They worked steadily through the morning, the rhythmic sounds of their labor, the thud of shovels, the creak of the post hole digger, the metallic hiss of wire being unspooled, filling the otherwise quiet landscape. The boundary line ran through rolling grassland dotted with small stands of trees, the perfect terrain for grazing cattle, but exposed to the elements for the men working. Around midday, as the spring sun beat down with unexpected intensity, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Zeke straightened, hand instinctively moving to the revolver on his hip, as 3 riders appeared on the Hoffman side of the fence line. He recognized Curtis from their previous encounter, but the other 2 men were strangers. The central rider, however, commanded immediate attention, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 20s, expensively dressed for ranch work, with cold eyes set in a handsome, arrogant face. That'll be Victor Hoffman, Cooper muttered, moving to stand beside Zeke, and he ain't known for his friendly disposition. The riders stopped directly across from their work site. Victor Hoffman surveyed their progress with obvious displeasure before addressing them. "You Valerian hands sure are industrious all of a sudden. Any particular reason you're reinforcing this section of fence?" Zeke stepped forward, keeping his stance relaxed but alert. "Just maintenance, Mr. Hoffman, making sure cattle stay where they belong on both sides." "Interesting timing," Hoffman replied, his gaze sharpening. "Right after some of your strays found their way onto my father's land." His eyes narrowed as he studied Zeke more carefully. "You're new. I don't recognize you from Valerian's usual crew." "Zeke Harrington." "Harrington," Hoffman repeated, as if testing the name. "You're the one who faced down Curtis and Joe the other day." "With Miss Valerian's unexpected assistance." His mouth twisted on Daisy's name, revealing a bitterness that seemed personal rather than business. "Just doing my job," Zeke replied evenly. "Same as today." Hoffman's cold eyes assessed him more carefully. A man loyal to his employer. Admirable. "But you should know what kind of outfit you've signed on with, Harrington. Old Valerian's losing his grip on that spread. Half the county knows the daughter's been running things, trying to hold it together." He leaned forward in his saddle. "It's only a matter of time before they lose it all. Smart men are already looking elsewhere for their future." The implied threat was clear, both to the Valerian Ranch and to any hands loyal to it. Zeke maintained his neutral expression, though internally his dislike for Victor Hoffman solidified into something harder. "Appreciate the concern," he said flatly, "but I'll take my chances where I am." A flash of anger crossed Hoffman's face at the rebuff. "Your choice, but that fence better not encroach 1 inch onto Hoffman land. We'll be watching." He turned his horse, then paused. "And tell Miss Valerian that hiding behind hired guns won't change the inevitable. She should have accepted my offer when she had the chance." With that, the three riders wheeled their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and tension behind them. "Charming fellow," Zeke observed dryly when they were out of earshot. Cooper spat on the ground. Victor Hoffman's had his eye on the Valerian spread for years. Figures marrying Miss Daisy is easier than buying the ranch outright. The older man shook his head. "Can't blame him for wanting the land. The Valerian water rights to Silver Creek make it twice as valuable, but his methods leave something to be desired." "Was there ever a formal understanding between them?" Zeke asked, returning to work on the post hole he'd been digging. "Not from Miss Daisy's side," Cooper replied, "but old Hoffman and Victor convinced themselves it was just a matter of time when she made her feelings clear at that dance." He chuckled at the memory. "Well, Victor Hoffman isn't accustomed to being refused anything he wants." Zeke drove the post hole digger into the earth with perhaps more force than necessary. "Some men need to learn that lesson earlier in life." Cooper gave him a speculative look. "You seem to have taken a particular interest in Miss Daisy's welfare, Harrington." "I respect capability," Zeke replied tersely. "And I dislike men who think they're entitled to whatever they want." He straightened, meeting Cooper's gaze directly. "That's all." "Of course," Cooper agreed, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Just an observation." They returned to work, but Zeke's thoughts remained unsettled. Victor Hoffman's warning about the Valerian Ranch's precarious position troubled him more than he wanted to admit. Was the operation truly in danger? Daisy had hinted at her father's withdrawal from active management, but she hadn't suggested financial trouble. More disturbing was his own reaction to the implied threat against her. The surge of protectiveness he'd felt was unwelcome and complicated. He had come to Wyoming to earn his stake and move on, not to involve himself in ranch feuds or develop concerns for a woman he barely knew. Yet as they continued reinforcing the boundary fence, Zeke found himself working with increased determination. Whatever Victor Hoffman's designs on the Valerian Ranch or its capable manager, they would at least have to contend with a properly constructed fence line first. It was a small stand against forces larger than himself, but it was something concrete he could do, and for now that would have to be enough. The fence project continued for 5 days, with Zeke and his small crew working from dawn until dusk to reinforce the entire boundary section. Each day they spotted Hoffman riders watching from a distance, though Victor himself didn't return. The silent observation was clearly meant to intimidate, but Zeke ignored it, focusing instead on creating the sturdiest barrier possible between the two properties. On the afternoon of the fifth day, as they were completing the final section, Daisy rode out to inspect their work. She dismounted gracefully, walking the length of the new fence with a critical eye, testing posts and examining the wire tension. "This is excellent work, Mr. Harrington," she said finally, genuine approval in her voice. "Johnson was right about your skill with fences." "It'll hold," Zeke confirmed, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve. "Even if cattle press against it from either side. Or if someone tries to cut it," she added quietly, her gaze drifting to where two Hoffman riders were visible on a distant ridge. "Cooper told me about Victor's visit. Was he very unpleasant?" "Nothing we couldn't handle," Zeke assured her, deliberately keeping his tone casual. "He seems to have strong feelings about the Valerian Ranch." A shadow crossed Daisy's face. "And about me, no doubt," she sighed, turning back to Zeke. "Victor Hoffman believes everything and everyone has a price, including me." The bitterness in her voice prompted Zeke to ask, "Is there truth to what he implied?" "About the ranch being in trouble." Daisy hesitated, glancing at Cooper and Erickson, who were loading tools onto the wagon out of earshot. "Walk with me, Mr. Harrington," she said finally, moving away from the fence line. When they were a sufficient distance away, she spoke candidly. "We're not in immediate danger, but the situation isn't ideal. My father—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "After my mother died, my father lost his passion for ranching. He still manages the finances and makes the major decisions, but his heart isn't in it the way it once was." "And you've been filling the gap," Zeke observed. "As best I can." She looked out across the vast Valerian rangeland, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. "I love this land, Mr. Harrington. It's part of me in a way I can't fully explain. But running a ranch of this size requires capital and connections that are difficult for a woman to access alone. Your father won't help. He doesn't realize how much help is needed." Sadness touched her features. "He sees me as his little girl still, not as a capable ranch manager. And the bank," she shook her head. "Mr. Peterson at the Clearwater Bank is an old-fashioned man. He's reluctant to discuss business matters with me directly, and when he does speak with my father, he paints a rosier picture than reality warrants." Zeke absorbed this information silently. The Valerian Ranch appeared prosperous to outside eyes, but beneath the surface, the operation was more vulnerable than it seemed. It explained Daisy's constant presence in all aspects of the ranch work, her determination to prove herself capable in every task. "Victor Hoffman knows this," she continued, her voice hardening. "His father has significant influence with the bank. They've been waiting for us to falter so they can move in, either through a forced sale or," she trailed off, distaste evident in her expression. "Or through marriage," Zeke finished for her. "Yes," she met his gaze directly, "which is why this fence matters so much. It's not just about keeping cattle where they belong. It's a statement that the Valerian Ranch is still strong, still defended." The vulnerability beneath her determined exterior moved something in Zeke that he'd thought long buried. Before he could consider his words, he found himself saying, "You're not alone in this, Miss Valerian. The hands respect you. They'll stand with you." Surprise flickered in her green eyes, followed by cautious warmth. "Including you, Mr. Harrington. I was under the impression you weren't planning to stay beyond the season." The direct question caught him off guard. It was true, he had never intended Wyoming to be more than a temporary stop on his journey west. Yet standing there with Daisy Valerian, looking out over the land she loved so fiercely, his certainty wavered. "I keep my commitments," he said finally, unwilling to promise more than that. "For this season, at least, you can count me among those standing with you." It wasn't everything, but it was honest. And the smile that touched Daisy's lips in response, small but genuine, suggested it was enough for now. "Thank you," she said simply. Then, with a visible return to her practical nature, she gestured toward the completed fence. You and the men deserve a day of rest after this work. Take tomorrow off before rejoining the regular rotation." As she mounted her horse to return to the ranch house, Zeke found himself watching her departure longer than necessary. The conversation had left him unsettled, aware that he was becoming entangled in the very sort of local complications he had always been careful to avoid. Yet he couldn't bring himself to regret the commitment he had made. For better or worse, he was now aligned with the Valerian cause, and with the remarkable woman who championed it. The summer days lengthened as Wyoming Territory settled into its brief but glorious warm season. The roundup completed, the Valerian Ranch settled into its regular routine: cattle drives to summer pastures, hay cutting in the lower meadows, endless maintenance of the far-flung operation. Through it all, Zeke worked steadily, earning the respect of the other hands with his quiet competence and unflagging endurance. Despite his initial determination to remain detached, he found himself drawn into the tight-knit community of the ranch. He still spoke little compared to most, but he no longer avoided the evening gatherings around the cookhouse fire or declined invitations to join card games on Saturday nights. More significantly, he found himself watching for Daisy Valerian's daily rides around the property, their brief exchanges becoming a fixture of his routine that he was reluctant to examine too closely. A month after the boundary fence was completed, Johnson assigned Zeke to accompany Daisy on a 3-day inspection of the northern pastures. They set out at dawn, riding single file along the narrow trail that wound through the foothills, leading pack horses carrying their supplies. The first day passed in companionable focus on their task, checking cattle, water sources, and the condition of the rangeland. Daisy's knowledge of the territory impressed Zeke once again. She could identify distant landmarks, recognize individual cattle from the herd, and predict weather changes from subtle shifts in the wind direction. As dusk approached, they made camp in a sheltered spot near a small stream. While Zeke tended the horses, Daisy efficiently prepared their simple meal over a small fire. The domesticity of the scene struck Zeke as they sat together in the gathering darkness, eating beans and bacon from tin plates. "You're comfortable out here," he observed, breaking their companionable silence. Some women would find camping beneath the stars somewhat primitive. Daisy smiled, the firelight casting warm shadows across her face. "My mother used to bring Thomas and me up to these pastures when we were children. She believed in knowing every inch of our land." Her expression grew thoughtful. She was from Boston originally, a proper Eastern lady who scandalized her family by marrying a frontier rancher, but she adapted. She used to say that true refinement comes from the spirit, not surroundings. "She sounds remarkable." She was. Daisy set aside her empty plate. "What about your family, Mr. Harrington?" "You've never mentioned them." Zeke tensed slightly, the question touching on memories he rarely revisited. "Not much to tell. Father died when I was young. Mother raised my sister and me until the fever took her when I was 15. My sister married a shopkeeper in Austin before the war." He stared into the fire, deliberately vague. "We lost touch during the fighting." Daisy studied him across the flames. "You haven't tried to find her since?" The direct question deserved a direct answer, though it cost him to give it. "After I switched sides, I thought it better not to bring trouble to her door. Texas wasn't kind to Union sympathizers, even after the war ended." "But that was years ago," Daisy pointed out gently. "Surely now—" "Some decisions can't be undone," Zeke interrupted, more sharply than he intended. Seeing her startled expression, he moderated his tone. "I made choices that had consequences. My sister has her life. I have mine." "Alone," Daisy said softly, not a question but an observation. Zeke met her gaze across the fire. "It's simpler that way." "Simpler perhaps, but is it better?" She didn't wait for his answer, rising to gather their plates. "You should get some rest, Mr. Harrington. We have a long ride tomorrow if we're to reach the North Ridge by nightfall." As she moved away to wash their dishes in the stream, Zeke remained by the fire, unsettled by the conversation. Daisy had a way of asking questions that penetrated the careful armor he had built around himself. not with force, but with genuine interest that made deflection feel dishonest. More troubling was his growing desire to answer her questions truthfully, to share the parts of himself he had kept carefully hidden for so long. It was a dangerous impulse for a man who had survived by revealing little and expecting less. When she returned to the fire, she seemed to sense his discomfort and steered their conversation to safer topics. The condition of the cattle they had seen that day, plans for rotating the herds between pastures, expectations for the fall market. Professional matters that required no personal disclosure from either of them. Yet as they prepared their separate bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, Zeke found himself strangely dissatisfied with the return to practical matters. For the first time in years, he had felt the stirring of something like connection in their brief moment of personal exchange. And despite all his hard-earned caution, a part of him had welcomed it. That night beneath the vast Wyoming sky filled with stars, Zeke lay awake long after Daisy's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep. The false belief that had guided him for so long, that isolation was safety, that connection invited only pain, suddenly seemed less certain than it once had. The realization was as terrifying as it was liberating. The second day of their journey took them higher into the foothills, following the meandering path of Silver Creek to its source. The landscape grew more dramatic as they climbed, stands of pine and aspen giving way to rocky outcroppings and sweeping views across the territory. Small herds of Valerian cattle grazed in high meadows, fat and content on the rich summer grass. By mid-afternoon, heavy clouds had begun gathering over the distant mountains, promising an evening storm. Daisy pointed to a rocky outcrop about a mile ahead. "There's an old line shack just beyond those rocks," she explained. "We should reach it before the weather turns." As they rode, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Lightning flickered on the horizon, followed by the low rumble of thunder. Their horses grew skittish, sensing the approaching storm. "We need to hurry," Daisy called over the rising wind. "These mountain storms can turn dangerous quickly." They urged their mounts to a faster pace, the pack horses following reluctantly. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as they rounded the rocky outcrop, revealing a small, sturdy cabin nestled against the hillside. By the time they reached it, the rain was falling in earnest, driven sideways by gusting wind. They dismounted quickly, leading the horses to a lean-to shelter attached to the cabin. Working together efficiently, they unsaddled the animals and secured their gear just as the full force of the storm broke over them. Lightning cracked nearby as they dashed from the lean-to to the cabin's door, rain soaking them in the brief exposure. The line shack was simple but sound, a single room with a small fireplace, rough-hewn table and chairs, and two narrow cots against opposite walls. It smelled of dust and disuse but offered welcome shelter from the tempest outside. "We're lucky," Daisy said, pushing wet strands of blonde hair from her face. "This is one of the better outposts. Some are little more than 3 walls and a roof." Zeke moved to the fireplace, finding a small stack of firewood and kindling left by the last occupant. "You're shivering," he observed. "Get out of those wet clothes while I start a fire." Under other circumstances, such a suggestion to a respectable young woman might have been scandalous, but frontier practicality overrode convention. Survival came first. Propriety was a luxury afforded to those with solid walls and settled communities. While Zeke busied himself with the fire, deliberately keeping his back turned, Daisy changed into her spare clothing. The small sounds of movement behind him, the rustle of fabric, quiet footsteps, made him acutely aware of her presence in the confined space. "You should change too," she said once she was decent. "I'll see to our supplies." They moved around each other carefully in the small cabin, maintaining a polite distance that did little to diminish the sudden intimacy of their situation. Outside, the storm raged, rattling the shuttered windows and sending occasional drafts down the chimney that made the new-caught fire sputter. As evening fell, the interior of the cabin grew warmer. They sat at the rough table, eating a cold supper of beef jerky, hard biscuits, and dried fruit, the fire inadequate for cooking but sufficient to take the damp chill from the air. "I came here once with Thomas during a summer storm much like this one," Daisy said, breaking a long silence. "I was 12, he was 16. We'd ridden out to check the high pastures against Father's explicit instructions." A fond smile touched her lips at the memory. "We were soaked through and certain we'd be in terrible trouble when we returned. Thomas spent hours telling me wild stories to keep my mind off Father's coming punishment." "Were you punished?" Zeke asked, drawn into the personal remembrance despite himself. "Oh yes, a week of extra chores for both of us." Her smile faded slightly, but Mother understood our restlessness, I think. She slipped us extra desserts when Father wasn't looking. Outside, thunder crashed directly overhead, making the cabin shudder. Daisy's hand instinctively reached across the table, briefly touching Zeke's arm before she caught herself and withdrew. "Sorry," she murmured, embarrassed. "I've never quite outgrown my childhood fear of thunder." "No need to apologize." Zeke hesitated, then offered quietly, "My sister was the same way. During storms, she'd sneak into my room and hide under my blankets until it passed." The small confession, one of the few personal details he had voluntarily shared, seemed to please Daisy. "You were close, then." Once, the single word carried weight that Zeke hadn't intended, revealing more than he had meant to about the loss he still felt. Daisy studied him across the table, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. "Do you ever think of going back to Texas to find her?" The question hung between them, more significant than its simple words suggested. It wasn't just about his sister, Zeke realized, but about his entire philosophy of detachment, the walls he had built to protect himself from connection and its inevitable pain. "I used to," he admitted finally. "But after so many years, people change. I'm not the brother she knew." "Or perhaps you're exactly who she needs to know now," Daisy suggested gently. "The man her brother became, not just the boy he was." The insight was unexpectedly perceptive, touching a truth Zeke had avoided confronting. Before he could respond, however, a particularly violent gust of wind blew the cabin door open, sending rain and debris scattering across the plank floor. They both jumped up, rushing to secure the door against the storm's fury. As they struggled with the warped wood and rusted latch, their hands brushed repeatedly, each brief contact sending an awareness through Zeke that had nothing to do with the cold rain soaking them once again. When the door was finally secured, they stood facing each other in the narrow entry, closer than propriety would normally allow. Water dripped from Daisy's honey-blonde hair, trailing down her flushed cheeks. In the flickering firelight, her eyes seemed to hold questions Zeke wasn't ready to answer, and possibilities he wasn't prepared to acknowledge. "You're soaked again," he said roughly, stepping back to put distance between them. "You should move closer to the fire." She nodded, a flicker of something, disappointment, relief, crossing her features before she composed herself. "Yes, you're right, it would be foolish to risk catching cold out here." They returned to their places on opposite sides of the cabin, the storm continuing its assault outside, while a different kind of tension built within. As the evening wore on, they spoke little, each lost in private thoughts that seemed too dangerous to share. When they finally retired to their separate cots, Zeke lay awake listening to the gradual softening of the storm and Daisy's even breathing across the room. For the first time in years, his carefully constructed solitude felt not like protection but like deprivation, a prison of his own making that kept out pain but also prevented anything meaningful from entering. The realization was unwelcome, but impossible to ignore in the enforced intimacy of the storm-bound cabin. Something was changing within him, wearing away at convictions that had once seemed unassailable. And the catalyst for that change slept peacefully just a few feet away, unaware of the turmoil her simple questions and genuine interest had created in a man who had forgotten how to connect. Morning broke clear and brilliant after the storm, the high country washed clean by the night's deluge. They set out early, completing their inspection of the northern pastures by midday and turning back toward the main ranch. The ride home was largely silent, both of them absorbed in their own thoughts after the unexpected intimacy of the storm-bound night. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the Valerian Ranch, the peaceful scene below was marred by unusual activity, riders moving rapidly across the property, a wagon being hastily loaded near the barn. "Something's wrong," Daisy said, spurring her horse into a gallop down the slope. Zeke followed close behind, tension building as they approached. Johnson met them in the ranch yard, his weathered face grave. "Miss Daisy, thank God you're back." "There's been trouble." "What kind of trouble?" she demanded, dismounting quickly. "Hoffman men cut the fence line last night during the storm, drove off about 30 head of our prime breeding stock." Johnson's jaw tightened. "Cooper and Riley tried to stop them. Riley took a bullet in the shoulder. Cooper's with him in the bunkhouse. Doc Simmons is tending to him now." Zeke watched the color drain from Daisy's face, though her composure never faltered. "Where's my father?" "Gone to town to speak with the sheriff, but—" Johnson hesitated. "But what?" Daisy pressed. "Sheriff Tanner rides with Eli Hoffman every Sunday. They're old friends from way back. Don't expect much help from that quarter." The foreman looked apologetically at Daisy. "Your pa said to gather some men and track the cattle but not to cross onto Hoffman land. Said he'd handle it through legal channels." Daisy's expression hardened. "Legal channels haven't stopped the Hoffmans yet." "How many men have you gathered?" "4 ready to ride, including me. But Miss Daisy, your father was clear." "My father isn't here, and those cattle represent our best breeding stock." She turned to Zeke. "Mr. Harrington, will you ride with us? You're under no obligation, given what happened to Riley." Zeke met her determined gaze, understanding the stakes. This wasn't just about stolen cattle. It was a direct challenge to the Valerian Ranch's viability, a calculated strike when the owner was absent and his daughter presumably away from the property. "I'll ride," he said simply. "When do we leave?" Relief touched her features briefly. "Immediately. Johnson, have the men ready in 10 minutes. Full gear, 2 days' provisions." She strode toward the main house. "I need to change and get my rifle." As the ranch hands scrambled to prepare, Zeke approached the bunkhouse to check on Riley. The young cowhand lay pale but conscious on his bunk, his shoulder heavily bandaged. "Should have seen them coming," Riley said weakly when he spotted Zeke. "They waited for the worst of the storm when visibility was near zero. Must have been watching the ranch, knowing you and Miss Daisy were away." "How many?" "6, maybe 7. Victor Hoffman was leading them." Riley's face twisted with anger and pain. "They laughed, Harrington. When Cooper went down, they laughed like it was some kind of game." Zeke's expression remained impassive, though cold fury settled in his chest. "Rest easy. We'll get the cattle back." Outside, the tracking party was assembling. Daisy emerged from the main house dressed in practical riding clothes, her blonde hair braided tightly, a Winchester rifle in her hands. She moved with purposeful efficiency, checking supplies and conferring with Johnson about their route. When she approached Zeke, her expression was resolute. "Mr. Harrington, I want to be clear. This mission is to recover our cattle, not to seek retribution. I won't risk any man's life for vengeance." "Understood," he met her gaze steadily. "But if Hoffman's men resist?" "Then we do what's necessary to protect ourselves and retrieve what's ours." Her green eyes hardened. "The Valerian Ranch has never started a fight, but we don't back down from one either." With that, she mounted her horse, the assembled men following suit. As they rode out, Zeke found himself watching Daisy with new appreciation. Despite her youth and the constraints society placed on her gender, she led with natural authority, her determination inspiring loyalty from hardened men who might have resented taking orders from a woman under other circumstances. They followed the cattle tracks west, toward the boundary that separated Valerian land from Hoffman Territory. The storm had made tracking more difficult, washing away some sign, but Johnson's experience and Zeke's sharp eyes kept them on the trail. By late afternoon, they reached the place where the fence had been cut, a clean section of wire snipped with heavy cutters, the posts still standing. Beyond lay Hoffman land and somewhere, the stolen Valerian cattle. Daisy surveyed the boundary, her expression grim. "This is deliberate provocation. They want us to cross over, to give them justification for whatever comes next." "What's your decision?" Johnson asked quietly. She was silent for a long moment, weighing her options. Finally, she squared her shoulders. We follow the cattle, stay together, alert for ambush. If we locate them on Hoffman land, Johnson and I will approach openly to demand their return. The rest of you provide cover, but remain hidden unless needed. It was a reasonable plan, minimizing the risk of violence while still asserting Valerian rights. Zeke nodded his approval, impressed once again by her strategic thinking. They crossed the boundary as dusk approached, moving cautiously into Hoffman Territory. The landscape grew more rugged, with rocky outcroppings providing potential hiding places for watchers. Zeke felt the weight of unseen eyes, though no challenge came as they followed the increasingly clear trail of the stolen herd. Night was falling when they spotted the cattle, gathered in a small canyon about a mile inside Hoffman land. A makeshift camp had been established nearby, with 3 men visible around a small fire. "Too easy," Zeke murmured to Daisy as they observed from a concealed position. "Only 3 men to guard 30 valuable cattle." She nodded, her expression troubled. "They're expecting us. This is a trap." "Question is, what kind?" Johnson added. "Could be they're hoping to catch us in the act of trespassing, or they're planning something worse," Daisy finished grimly. "Either way, we need those cattle back." As they watched, a rider approached the camp from the direction of the main Hoffman Ranch. Even at a distance, Victor Hoffman's distinctive figure was recognizable. He dismounted, speaking animatedly to the men around the fire, gesturing occasionally toward the surrounding ridgelines. "He's coordinating something," Zeke observed. "Positioning men, probably." Daisy's jaw tightened. "We can't wait for whatever he's planning. Johnson, you and the others circle around to the east side of the canyon. Be ready to drive the cattle back toward Valerian land when I give the signal." She turned to Zeke. "You and I will approach directly. 2 riders look less threatening than 6. It was a dangerous plan, placing Daisy directly in the path of potential violence. Zeke started to object, then stopped himself, recognizing the determination in her eyes. This was her ranch, her cattle, her fight. She had earned the right to lead it. "Stay behind me if things go wrong," was all he said. They waited until Johnson and the others had disappeared into the gathering darkness before starting their approach. They rode openly, making no attempt to conceal their presence, Daisy slightly ahead as befitted her position as the Valerian representative. The men at the campfire spotted them when they were about 50 yards out. Victor Hoffman rose slowly, hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. The other men spread out slightly, their postures alert but not overtly threatening. "Miss Valerian," Victor called as they drew closer. "What an unexpected pleasure, though I must point out you're trespassing on Hoffman land." Daisy reined her horse to a stop at a cautious distance. "I believe you have something that belongs to me, Mr. Hoffman. 30 head of Valerian cattle, to be precise." Victor's handsome features arranged themselves into an expression of exaggerated confusion. "Valerian cattle, on Hoffman land," he turned to his men. "Did any of you drive Valerian cattle here?" The obvious mockery brought color to Daisy's cheeks, though her voice remained steady. "They were driven through a cut section of our boundary fence during last night's storm. One of my men was shot in the process. I want them returned immediately, and I want the name of the man who fired that shot." "Serious accusations, Miss Valerian." Victor's tone hardened. "Do you have proof to support them?" "The cattle tracks lead directly from our cut fence to this canyon," Daisy replied. "And they're wearing the Valerian brand, as you well know." Victor stepped closer, his cold gaze shifting to Zeke. "I see you've brought protection this time. Your new hand seems to have taken a special interest in Valerian affairs." His mouth twisted in a humorless smile, or perhaps just in the Valerian daughter. Zeke remained expressionless, though his hand moved subtly closer to his own weapon. "Mr. Harrington works for the Valerian Ranch," Daisy said coolly, "as do the other men currently surrounding this canyon with rifles trained on your position." It was a bluff. Johnson and the others were positioned to drive the cattle, not to engage in a firefight. But Victor's momentary hesitation suggested it had the desired effect. You've developed quite a backbone, Daisy, Victor said, dropping the pretense of formality. It's an attractive quality, though misplaced in this situation. He gestured toward the stolen cattle. Take them if you want them so badly. They wandered onto our land, we gathered them for safekeeping. Consider it a neighborly gesture. The too-easy capitulation raised warning flags in Zeke's mind. Victor was conceding too quickly, which meant the real trap lay elsewhere. We'll take them now, Daisy said, clearly sharing Zeke's suspicion but unwilling to reject the apparent victory. She raised her arm, the signal for Johnson and the others to begin moving the cattle. As the Valerian hands emerged from hiding and started toward the herd, Victor stepped back, a satisfied smile playing across his features. Of course, I should mention that my father sent word to Sheriff Tanner this afternoon about Valerian riders trespassing on our property. He's probably on his way right now with a warrant for your arrest. The real plan became clear, not violence but legal entanglement. If Sheriff Tanner caught them on Hoffman land with the cattle, it would be their word against the Hoffmans about who had taken them in the first place. Given the sheriff's friendship with Eli Hoffman, the outcome was predictable. How much time do we have? Zeke asked quietly. Victor's smile widened. Not enough, I'd say. The sheriff left town over an hour ago. Daisy's expression remained composed, though Zeke could see the calculation behind her eyes. Then we'd best hurry, she said calmly. Johnson, get the cattle moving now. The next few minutes were controlled chaos as the Valerian hands urged the reluctant cattle into motion, driving them toward the boundary fence. Victor and his men made no move to stop them, watching with smug confidence as the slow-moving herd began its journey back to Valerian land. You won't make it, Victor called as Daisy turned her horse to follow. And when Tanner arrests you, your father will have to come to terms with my father at last. Perhaps we can still arrange that marriage we discussed as part of the settlement. Something in his tone, the absolute certainty of victory, the casual cruelty, made Zeke's control slip. He turned his horse, facing Victor directly. You set this up from the beginning, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Cut the fence, stole the cattle, shot an unarmed man, all to force a confrontation you could use against the Valerians. Victor's expression hardened. Careful, Drifter, you're just passing through. This is between established families. No, Zeke replied, his blue eyes cold as winter sky. You made it my business when you shot my friend and threatened my employer. He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. Remember this, Hoffman. If any harm comes to Miss Valerian or any Valerian hand because of your schemes, there won't be a sheriff in Wyoming who can protect you. That's not a threat, it's a promise. Before Victor could respond, Zeke wheeled his horse around and rode after Daisy, who had already started after the moving herd. They caught up with Johnson and the others, who were struggling to keep the cattle moving at a pace that might outrun the approaching law. We need to split up, Zeke told Daisy as they rode. The cattle are moving too slowly. If Tanner catches us all here, he'll have witnesses to support Hoffman's claim. What do you suggest? She asked, trusting his judgment without hesitation. Johnson and 2 men stay with the herd, keep them moving toward the boundary. You, me, and Cooper ride ahead, create a diversion on the main trail. Make it look like we're the only ones who came after the cattle. Draw Tanner away from the herd's actual path. Daisy considered the plan quickly, then nodded. Johnson, she called to the foreman, you heard Mr. Harrington. Keep the cattle moving no matter what. We'll draw off any pursuit. Within minutes, they had separated from the main group. Zeke led them on a deliberately obvious trail toward a different section of the boundary, leaving clear tracks for any pursuing lawman to follow. They rode hard, pushing their horses as much as they dared in the growing darkness. They were perhaps half a mile from Valerian land when they heard riders approaching from the west, at least 4 horses, moving fast. Sheriff's posse, Cooper muttered, right where Hoffman wanted them. Daisy's face was pale but determined in the faint moonlight. We keep riding. Once we cross back onto Valerian land, Tanner has no jurisdiction without a proper warrant. It was a slim hope, but the only one they had. They urged their horses to greater speed, racing for the boundary fence that marked safety. Behind them, the pursuing riders drew closer, the sound of hoofbeats mingling with shouted commands to halt. When they reached the fence line, Zeke dismounted quickly, holding the wire down for Daisy and Cooper to cross with their horses. As Cooper cleared the boundary, a rifle shot cracked through the night air, the bullet thudding into the fence post inches from Zeke's head. "Hold it right there," Sheriff Tanner's voice rang out. "Next shot won't miss." Zeke froze, calculating options, aware of Daisy's horrified gaze from just beyond the fence. The sheriff and 3 deputies approached cautiously, rifles trained on him. "You're on Hoffman land, son," Tanner said as they drew closer, "and I've got a complaint about Valerian hands stealing cattle." "Want to explain yourself?" "No cattle here, Sheriff," Zeke replied calmly. "Just 3 riders heading home after a long day." Tanner dismounted, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a perpetual scowl and cold eyes that assessed Zeke with instant dislike. "You must be the new hand Victor Hoffman mentioned. Harrington, is it?" "Zeke Harrington, yes." The sheriff glanced at Daisy and Cooper beyond the fence line. "Miss Valerian, interesting company you're keeping these days. Your father know you're out riding boundaries after dark with hired hands." "My father knows I'm retrieving stolen property, Sheriff," Daisy replied with dignity. "Hoffman men cut our fence during the storm and drove off 30 head of our breeding stock. They shot Riley Jenkins in the process." Tanner's expression remained skeptical. "That's quite a story. Eli Hoffman says you Valerians have been rustling his cattle for weeks. Says he caught your hands red-handed tonight." "That's a lie," Daisy said firmly. "And you know it, Sheriff. The Valerian Ranch has never stolen so much as a calf." The standoff stretched taut as wire, Zeke still on Hoffman land facing armed lawmen, Daisy and Cooper safe but separated on Valerian property. The wrong word or movement could spark violence neither side truly wanted. Finally, Sheriff Tanner sighed heavily. "Here's how this is going to work. Harrington, you're coming with me to answer some questions about tonight's activities. Miss Valerian, you and Cooper head on home. I'll be speaking with your father tomorrow about this mess." "Sheriff, Mr. Harrington was acting under my direction," Daisy protested. "If anyone should answer questions, it's me." "That's not how it works, Miss Valerian, and you know it." Tanner's tone brooked no argument. "Unless you prefer I arrest all 3 of you for suspected cattle rustling." Zeke caught Daisy's eye, giving a slight shake of his head. Her continued freedom was more important than his. She needed to ensure the stolen cattle made it safely back to Valerian land. "Go," he said quietly. "I'll be fine." Conflict warred in her expression, responsibility to the ranch against loyalty to the man who had ridden with her. Finally, practical necessity won out. "I'll tell my father what's happened," she promised. "He'll come to town first thing tomorrow." Tanner gestured for his deputies to secure Zeke, who submitted to being disarmed without resistance. As they led him to a spare horse, he glanced back at Daisy, still watching from beyond the fence line. Her face in the moonlight held a complex mixture of gratitude, worry, and something deeper that neither of them had dared name. In that moment, as he was led away toward an uncertain confrontation with frontier justice, Zeke realized with startling clarity that his careful plans for isolation had thoroughly unraveled. Somehow, without intending it, he had become entangled in the fate of the Valerian Ranch, and more dangerously, with the remarkable woman who fought so fiercely to protect it. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, as he rode away under guard, he found himself experiencing an unfamiliar emotion, the simple certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. The Clearwater jail was a sturdy if Spartan structure, 2 cells with iron bars, a small office area for the sheriff, and little else. Zeke spent an uncomfortable night on a narrow cot, listening to the occasional sounds of the small town settling into darkness. Sheriff Tanner had asked perfunctory questions about the evening's events, clearly uninterested in any explanation that contradicted the Hoffman version of events. "You'll go before Judge Wilson tomorrow," Tanner had informed him before locking the cell. "He rides circuit, happens to be in town for the week. Lucky coincidence." The satisfied smirk accompanying this statement suggested the timing was anything but coincidental. Dawn was just breaking when Zeke heard the front door of the jail open, followed by the low murmur of voices. One Tanner's gruff bass, the other a cultured tenor that carried authority despite its quieter tone. A moment later, the sheriff appeared with a tall, lean man in his 50s. Gray streaked the visitor's dark hair at the temples, and deep lines etched his once handsome face, but his bearing remained straight and dignified despite an obvious limp. "Here he is, Mr. Valerian," Tanner said, gesturing toward the cell. "Been quiet all night." Harold Valerian approached the bars, studying Zeke with keen intelligence that belied rumors of the rancher's withdrawal from active life. "Mr. Harrington, my daughter speaks highly of your actions last night." Zeke rose from the cot, meeting the older man's evaluating gaze. "Sir, is Miss Valerian well?" "Quite well, thank you. And determined to see you released." A brief smile touched Valerian's stern features. "She can be rather formidable when motivated." "I've noticed," Zeke acknowledged, earning another fleeting smile from the rancher. Harold Valerian turned to Sheriff Tanner. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Harrington privately, if you please." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded grudgingly. 5 minutes. Judge Wilson will be here at 9 to hear the case." When Tanner had retreated to the front office, closing the door behind him, Harold spoke in a lower tone. "The cattle made it back safely. Johnson and the men crossed at a different point, avoided the sheriff entirely." He studied Zeke thoughtfully. "That was your plan, I understand." "It seemed the best option at the time." "Indeed." Harold rested his hands on his walking stick, his expression growing more serious. "Judge Wilson is generally fair-minded, but he and Eli Hoffman share business interests in the railroad coming through. I cannot guarantee a favorable outcome today." Zeke accepted this assessment stoically. "I understand. What happens to the ranch if I'm convicted?" The question seemed to surprise Harold. "You're concerned about the ranch rather than your own predicament." "The Valerian Ranch is worth protecting," Zeke said simply. "I've seen how hard your daughter works to keep it that way." Something shifted in Harold Valerian's expression, a softening perhaps or recognition. "Yes, she does, more than I've properly acknowledged, I fear." He straightened, decision made. "Mr. Harrington, I'd like to offer you a proposition." "Sir?" "I will secure your release and all charges dropped, in exchange for your agreement to remain at the Valerian Ranch for a minimum of 1 year as my personal representative in matters regarding the Hoffman situation." Zeke's surprise must have shown on his face, for Harold continued quickly. "You've demonstrated loyalty, strategic thinking, and restraint under pressure, qualities I value. More importantly, my daughter trusts you, which is no small matter." His expression grew more grave. "The confrontation with the Hoffmans will escalate after last night. I need someone who can anticipate their moves and protect our interests. And my daughter." The unexpected offer left Zeke momentarily speechless. He had come to Wyoming intending to remain detached, earn his stake, and move on. Now Harold Valerian was asking for a year's commitment to the ranch, to the growing conflict with the Hoffmans, and by extension to Daisy herself. "You hardly know me," Zeke pointed out. "I could be exactly what Hoffman claims, a drifter with no stake in your land or its future." Harold's shrewd eyes assessed him. "You could be, but I don't believe you are. Daisy doesn't make mistakes about people's characters." He paused, then added more quietly, "Neither did her mother." The reference to his late wife carried weight that Zeke couldn't fully interpret but clearly felt significant to the older man. Before he could respond, Harold continued. "The position comes with a substantial increase in wages and a private cabin on the property rather than the bunkhouse. You would report directly to me, though you would work closely with Daisy on daily operations." He extended his hand through the cell bars. "Do we have an agreement, Mr. Harrington?" Zeke looked at the offered hand, aware he stood at a crossroads. Accept, and he committed himself to the Valerians and their struggles for at least a year. Refuse, and he would likely face conviction for a crime he didn't commit, followed by eventual release and the resumption of his solitary westward journey. but without the sense of purpose he had unexpectedly found at the Valerian Ranch. The choice, when framed that way, was surprisingly easy. He clasped Harold Valerian's hand firmly. "We have an agreement, sir." Harold nodded once, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Excellent. Now let's see about getting you out of this cell." The charges against Zeke were indeed dropped, though Judge Wilson made it clear the dismissal came with an expectation of no further incidents between the ranches. Both men knew it was an empty promise. The Hoffman-Valerian conflict had escalated beyond peaceful resolution with the cattle raid and Riley's shooting. By mid-morning, Zeke and Harold were riding back to the Valerian Ranch, the town of Clearwater receding behind them. They traveled in companionable silence for a time, each man measuring the other without obvious scrutiny. "My wife would have liked you," Harold said suddenly as they crested a hill overlooking the valley. "Catherine had a gift for seeing beneath surfaces. It's a quality Daisy inherited." Zeke glanced at the older man, whose gaze was fixed on the distant horizon. "You must miss her very much." Every day, Harold's voice carried the weight of grief still fresh despite the passing years. "When she died, something in me broke. I couldn't bear to engage with the world she'd left. The ranch, our friends, even our children, everything reminded me of her absence." He shook his head regretfully. "I retreated into ledgers and figures, things that required no emotional investment." The frank admission surprised Zeke. Harold Valerian had a reputation for being reserved, even remote. This vulnerable confession seemed out of character. "Why are you telling me this, sir?" Harold met his gaze directly. "Because I want you to understand what you're defending. The Valerian Ranch isn't just land and cattle, it's Catherine's legacy to our daughter, and I have failed to protect it properly." His hands tightened on the reins. "When Thomas died in the war, it broke Catherine's heart. When she followed him 3 years later, I allowed my grief to consume me, leaving Daisy to carry burdens no young woman should face alone." He gestured toward the ranch buildings, now visible in the distance. "She has managed admirably, better than I had any right to expect, but the Hoffmans sense weakness. They believe without a man's firm hand, the Valerian Ranch will eventually falter." A flash of the proud rancher emerged through the grief-worn exterior. "I intend to prove them wrong, with your help." Zeke considered this carefully before responding. "I gave you my word, Mr. Valerian. I'll stand with you and Miss Daisy against whatever comes." "Good," Harold nodded, apparently satisfied. "One more thing, Mr. Harrington. My daughter is the most precious thing in my life, though I've done a poor job of showing it these past years. If your interest in her should ever extend beyond professional loyalty, I expect you to approach me directly." The unexpected reference to Zeke's feelings for Daisy, feelings he had barely acknowledged to himself, caught him completely off guard. He opened his mouth to deny any such interest, then closed it again, unwilling to lie to this man who had shown him unexpected trust. "I understand, sir," he said instead, neither confirming nor denying what Harold had obviously perceived. A slight smile touched the older man's face. "I thought you might." He urged his horse to a faster pace. "Come. Daisy will be anxious for news of your release." They rode into the ranch yard to find Daisy waiting on the porch of the main house, her composed expression belied by the tension in her posture. When she saw Zeke riding beside her father, relief washed visibly across her features, followed quickly by a more guarded welcome. "I see you were successful, father," she said as they dismounted. "Welcome back, Mr. Harrington." "Thank you, Miss Valerian." Zeke removed his hat, suddenly aware of his disheveled appearance after a night in jail. "I appreciate your father's intervention on my behalf." Harold handed the reins of his horse to a waiting stable hand. "Mr. Harrington has agreed to take on special responsibilities regarding our Hoffman situation, Daisy. He'll be moving into the old foreman's cabin and working directly with us on strategic matters." Surprise flickered across Daisy's face. "I see that's welcome news." She looked at Zeke with a question in her green eyes that he couldn't quite interpret. "I'll leave you to fill Mr. Harrington in on what's happened during his absence," Harold said, moving toward the house. "I need to review the correspondence that arrived while I was in town." Left alone in the yard, Zeke and Daisy regarded each other with a new awareness. Something had shifted between them, though neither could precisely name the change. "You didn't have to agree to stay," she said finally. "I would have understood if you preferred to move on after all this trouble." "I gave my word I'd stand with you," Zeke reminded her. "That hasn't changed." "But a year's commitment." She searched his face, as if looking for signs of reluctance or regret. "That's considerably more than the seasonal work you originally sought." Zeke held her gaze steadily. "Plans change, Miss Valerian, sometimes for the better." A smile touched her lips, genuine and unguarded in a way he'd rarely seen. "Indeed they do, Mr. Harrington," she gestured toward the bunkhouse. "You should get cleaned up and rest. Tomorrow will bring challenges enough." As he watched her walk back to the main house, Zeke reflected on the strange turns his life had taken since arriving at the Valerian Ranch. He had come seeking temporary work and isolation, planning to earn his stake and continue westward to a solitary future. Instead, he had found purpose, connection, and now a formal commitment to remain for at least a year. More significantly, he had found himself drawn to Daisy Valerian in ways that defied his careful rules about attachment. The old fear still whispered its cautions. Connection meant vulnerability, caring invited loss. But for the first time in years, another voice answered, stronger and more insistent. Some things were worth the risk. The following weeks brought uneasy peace between the ranches. The Hoffman hands kept clear of the reinforced boundary fence, and no further cattle disappeared from either property. But tension simmered beneath the surface calm, evident in the armed riders who now accompanied every Valerian operation near the disputed borders, and the watchful eyes that scanned the horizon at the first sound of approaching horses. Zeke settled into his new role with characteristic efficiency. The former foreman's cabin, vacant since Johnson had moved into the bunkhouse years earlier, became his private domain. A modest but comfortable space apart from the other hands, but close enough to the main operations to facilitate his new responsibilities. His relationship with the ranch hands shifted subtly with his change in status. No longer simply one of the crew, he now occupied an ambiguous position between the men and management. Some, like Cooper and Riley, now recovered from his wound, accepted the change without question. Others regarded him with a wariness that Zeke understood but did not attempt to dispel. Results would speak for themselves in time. More complex was his evolving relationship with Daisy. Their shared experiences during the cattle recovery had created a bond that transcended employer and employee, yet propriety and Zeke's own caution maintained a careful distance between them. They worked together daily, their natural compatibility making them an effective team, but neither acknowledged the undercurrent that occasionally surfaced in held gazes or accidental touches. Summer reached its golden peak, the hayfields ripening under the Wyoming sun. The annual Founders' Day celebration in Clearwater approached, a tradition that even the simmering ranch feud couldn't disrupt. Despite the tension with the Hoffmans, the Valerians were expected to attend as one of the founding families of the territory. The evening before the celebration, Zeke was reviewing boundary patrol schedules in his cabin when a knock at the door interrupted his concentration. He opened it to find Daisy standing on his small porch, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. "Miss Valerian, is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong." She hesitated, an uncharacteristic uncertainty in her manner. "May I come in? I have some figures I'd like to discuss before tomorrow's trip to town." The request was perfectly proper. They often reviewed ranch business together, yet something in her demeanor suggested another purpose entirely. Zeke stepped aside, gesturing her into the cabin's small sitting area. The space was simply furnished but meticulously neat, reflecting its occupant's orderly nature. A small bookshelf held a surprising number of volumes, history, philosophy, and a few dog-eared novels. A framed daguerreotype stood on the mantel, the only personal item visible, a young woman with Zeke's eyes smiling faintly at the camera. "Your sister?" Daisy asked, noticing the direction of his gaze. "Yes." "Taken before the war." He moved to the small table that served as his desk. "You mentioned figures." Daisy placed her portfolio on the table but made no move to open it. Instead, she turned to face him directly. "Actually, I wanted to speak with you about tomorrow's celebration. I've arranged for extra hands to remain at the ranch while the rest of you are in town," Zeke assured her. "The property will be secure." "That's not," she paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I assumed you would be accompanying us to town, as my father's representative." The invitation surprised him. "I thought my role was to oversee ranch security." "It is, but it's also to represent Valerian interests in the community." She met his gaze directly. "The Founders' Day celebration is attended by everyone of consequence in the territory. Your absence would be noted and potentially interpreted as weakness on our part." The logic was sound, though Zeke suspected there was more to the request than strategic considerations. "I'm not much for social gatherings, Miss Valerian." "Few of us are," she replied with a small smile, "but sometimes duty requires uncomfortable situations." Her expression grew more serious. "The Hoffmans will be there in force. Victor has made it known he intends to use the occasion to announce his engagement to Margaret Peterson, the banker's daughter." Ah, Zeke understood the implications immediately. The alliance with Clearwater's only bank would strengthen the Hoffman position considerably, potentially creating financial pressure on the Valerian operation. A calculated move. "Very much so. Father and I must attend to maintain appearances, but—" She hesitated, then continued with uncharacteristic directness. "I would feel more secure with you there, Mr. Harrington." The admission clearly cost her something in pride. Daisy Valerian rarely acknowledged needing protection or support, preferring to stand on her own strength. That she would ask this of him spoke volumes about her trust in him, and perhaps something more. "Then I'll attend," he said simply. "Though I should warn you, my dancing skills are non-existent." Relief and something warmer flickered across her features. "I wouldn't worry. I doubt many people will be eager to dance with either of us, given the current climate." She gathered her portfolio, apparently having accomplished her actual purpose in visiting. At the door she paused. "The celebration begins at noon, but the dancing isn't until evening. We'll depart at 10 if that suits you." "I'll be ready." After she left, Zeke remained standing in the center of his cabin, aware that something significant had just transpired between them. A subtle shift in their relationship that neither had explicitly acknowledged. Daisy had not come to discuss figures or security arrangements. She had come because she wanted him at her side during a difficult social obligation, as something more than an employee. The realization was both gratifying and unsettling. His carefully constructed walls were crumbling faster than he could reinforce them, eroded by his growing feelings for a woman who represented everything he had told himself he didn't want. Permanence, connection, a future rooted in one place with one person. Yet as he prepared for bed, Zeke found himself planning what he would wear to the Founders' Day celebration with an attention to detail that would have amused him in another man. It seemed that despite all his precautions, Zeke Harrington was indeed becoming entangled in the life of the Valerian Ranch and with its remarkable daughter. The thought no longer frightened him as it once would have. Instead, it filled him with an unfamiliar sensation that took him a moment to identify: hope. The Founders' Day celebration transformed the small town of Clearwater, with bunting and banners decorating the main street, stalls offering food and games, and a temporary dance floor erected in the town square. Families from throughout the territory converged on the settlement, setting aside ranch work and daily concerns for a rare day of communal festivity. Zeke rode beside the Valerian carriage, uncomfortably aware of his formal appearance. He had unearthed his one good suit, a dark broadcloth affair purchased years ago for occasions he'd generally avoided, and a string tie that felt like a noose around his neck. Judging from Daisy's appreciative glance when he joined them that morning, the effort hadn't gone unnoticed. Daisy herself had transformed for the occasion, exchanging her practical ranch attire for a gown of deep green silk that enhanced her eyes and complemented her honey-blonde hair, which had been arranged in an elegant style that softened her usually practical appearance. The effect was striking. She looked every inch the daughter of a prosperous rancher, with a poise and natural dignity that commanded respect. As they entered the town, Zeke was acutely conscious of the attention they attracted. The Valerian-Hoffman feud was common knowledge, and the recent cattle raid had only intensified public interest in the conflict. Harold Valerian's decision to emerge from his semi-reclusion for the celebration, accompanied by his daughter and their new representative, created a ripple of speculation among the gathered townsfolk. "Remember, we're here to maintain appearances," Harold murmured as they halted before the town hall, where the celebration would officially begin with speeches from prominent citizens. No confrontations, no matter what provocations might arise. The warning proved prescient. As they took their places among the audience for the opening ceremonies, the Hoffman contingent arrived. Eli Hoffman, a barrel-chested man with a thick beard and calculating eyes. Victor at his side, resplendent in an expensive Eastern suit, and on Victor's arm Margaret Peterson, the banker's daughter, a plain young woman whose nervous smile suggested her role in the alliance was not entirely voluntary. The two families pointedly ignored each other throughout the speeches, maintaining a cold civility that fooled no one. When the formal portion concluded and the crowd dispersed to enjoy the various activities, Zeke remained close to Daisy, acutely aware of Victor Hoffman's predatory gaze following them through the festivities. "He's planning something," Daisy murmured as they paused at a refreshment stand. "Victor never attends these gatherings without an agenda." Beyond announcing his strategic engagement, Zeke accepted a cup of lemonade from the vendor, passing it to Daisy before taking one for himself. "That's only part of it. Look at how he's working the crowd, speaking with every rancher, merchant, and official." Her green eyes narrowed in assessment. "He's building support for something." Zeke observed Victor moving through the celebration with practiced charm, shaking hands and engaging in animated conversation with influential citizens. Margaret Peterson remained dutifully at his side, though her expression grew increasingly strained as the afternoon progressed. "Your father seems to be countering his efforts," Zeke noted, watching as Harold Valerian engaged with his own circle of long-established connections. "Yes, but the Hoffmans have been cultivating these relationships for years while father has been absent." Concern creased Daisy's brow. "We're at a disadvantage." "Not entirely." Zeke nodded toward a group of working ranchers who had greeted Harold Valerian with evident respect. "Your father built this community alongside these people. Those bonds don't dissolve completely, even with years of withdrawal." His observation seemed to comfort her slightly. "I hope you're right. The Valerian name still carries weight, but influence requires presence." She sighed softly. "Something I've been trying to tell father for years." As the afternoon progressed, the underlying tension became increasingly palpable. The celebration divided subtly into factions, those aligned with the Hoffmans congregating near the bank and mercantile, while Valerian supporters gathered closer to the livery stable and general store. Neutral parties moved carefully between the groups, unwilling to explicitly declare allegiance to either side. The situation came to a head as dusk approached and preparations for the evening dance began. The town band took their positions on a small platform, tuning instruments as couples began to assemble around the wooden dance floor. Harold Valerian had engaged in conversation with Judge Wilson and several other territorial officials, leaving Daisy and Zeke standing slightly apart near the edge of the gathering. Victor Hoffman chose this moment to make his move. With deliberate showmanship, he led Margaret Peterson to the center of the dance floor, raising his hand for attention. The crowd gradually quieted, anticipation rippling through the assembled townsfolk. "Friends and neighbors," Victor called, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "On this Founders' Day, as we celebrate the pioneers who built this community through courage and vision, I have an announcement to make." He smiled down at Margaret, who managed a tremulous smile in return. "Miss Peterson has done me the great honor of accepting my proposal of marriage." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, though Zeke noted it came primarily from the Hoffman faction. Victor wasn't finished, however. "This union represents more than just the joining of two people," he continued. It symbolizes a new chapter for our growing community. The Hoffman Ranch and Peterson banking interests will be working together on an ambitious project, bringing the railroad spur directly to Clearwater, ensuring our town's future prosperity. This announcement drew genuine excitement from throughout the gathering. A railroad spur would transform the isolated settlement's economic prospects overnight, increasing property values and creating new opportunities for commerce. The preliminary surveys have already been completed, Victor continued, clearly enjoying his moment at the center of attention. Construction could begin as early as next spring, assuming all necessary land acquisitions proceed as planned. His gaze shifted deliberately toward Daisy and Zeke, the implication clear to anyone familiar with the local geography. The most direct route for a railroad spur would cut directly through the southeastern portion of Valerian land, the same section adjoining the Hoffman property that had been the site of so much contention. The calculated move left the Valerians in an impossible position. Public opposition to the railroad project would cast them as obstacles to community progress. Yet acquiescence meant surrendering valuable land to their rivals and potentially weakening their water rights to Silver Creek. Zeke felt Daisy stiffen beside him, though her expression remained composed. Around them, heads turned in their direction, waiting for a reaction to Victor's thinly veiled challenge. Before either could respond, Harold Valerian stepped forward, making his way deliberately to where his daughter stood. His face betrayed nothing as he addressed the crowd. The Valerian family congratulates Mr. Hoffman and Miss Peterson on their engagement, he said, his cultured voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent gathering. And we share the community's enthusiasm for progress that benefits all citizens of the territory. He paused, his gaze sweeping the assembled faces. However, as one of the original founders of this settlement, I must caution against hasty announcements regarding projects that have not yet been formally approved by the Territorial Commission. A murmur of uncertainty passed through the crowd. Harold continued smoothly. The Valerian Ranch has always supported development that respects established rights and follows proper legal procedures. We look forward to reviewing the official railroad proposal when it has been properly submitted to all affected parties. He smiled thinly. Until then, perhaps we should return to the celebration at hand. I believe this is a dance, after all. With that masterly deflection, he signaled to the band, which immediately struck up a lively tune. Couples began moving onto the dance floor, the tension partially diffused by Harold's diplomatic noncommittal response. Victor's expression darkened briefly before he masked it with a forced smile, leading Margaret into the first dance. Eli Hoffman, watching from the sidelines, made no attempt to hide his displeasure at having his son's moment of triumph partially undercut. "That was well handled," Zeke murmured to Harold as the older man rejoined them. "A temporary measure at best," Harold replied quietly. "Victor has outmaneuvered us with this railroad scheme. It aligns Hoffman interests with community progress while potentially forcing us to choose between our land and public opinion." His expression grew grave. "We'll need to develop a response quickly." "Can they really force a railroad through our property?" Daisy asked, concern evident in her voice. "Not without compensation, but the Territorial Commission has considerable latitude in such matters, especially when public benefit can be demonstrated." Harold's jaw tightened. "And with Peterson controlling the local banking and Judge Wilson already aligned with the Hoffmans through business interests." He didn't need to complete the thought. The Valerians faced a coordinated effort to pressure them from multiple directions: financial, legal, and now public opinion. It was a sophisticated strategy that went beyond simple ranch rivalry into the realm of territorial politics. "We should leave," Daisy suggested, watching Victor and Eli Hoffman move among their supporters, clearly building momentum for their announcement. "No," Harold said firmly. "That would only reinforce the perception that we're opposed to progress. We stay, we socialize, we dance." He glanced meaningfully at Zeke. "All of us." The pointed instruction was clear. Zeke turned to Daisy, extending his hand with formal courtesy. "Miss Valerian, would you do me the honor of this dance?" Surprise flickered across her features, followed by understanding. This was no longer simply a social occasion, but a tactical engagement in the ongoing conflict with the Hoffmans. Their public appearance mattered. "I would be delighted, Mr. Harrington," she replied, placing her gloved hand in his. As he led her onto the dance floor, Zeke was acutely conscious of the attention they attracted. The Valerian daughter dancing with her father's mysterious representative sent its own message to the watching community, one of confidence and unity in the face of the Hoffman challenge. "I thought you said your dancing skills were non-existent," Daisy murmured as they joined the waltz already in progress. "I may have exaggerated slightly," Zeke admitted, guiding her smoothly through the steps. Army officers were expected to maintain certain social graces, even during the war. The small personal revelation seemed to please her. "You continue to surprise me, Mr. Harrington." "As do you, Miss Valerian." His hand at her waist was proper but warm, the connection between them transcending the formality of the dance. "I didn't expect to find myself in the middle of territorial politics when I rode into Clearwater Valley." A smile touched her lips. "Life rarely follows our expectations, does it?" "No," he agreed, his gaze holding hers. "Sometimes it offers something better." The simple statement carried weight beyond its words, acknowledging the shift that had occurred between them over the past months. Daisy's eyes widened slightly, a flush rising to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the exertion of the dance. Before she could respond, the music ended, requiring them to separate and acknowledge the conclusion with formal bows. As they moved off the dance floor, Zeke noticed Victor Hoffman watching them with barely concealed irritation. The public solidarity of the Valerians and Daisy's obvious comfort with Zeke clearly disrupted whatever narrative he had planned for the evening. The remainder of the celebration passed without further confrontation, though the undercurrents of tension remained. The Valerian party departed as the festivities wound down, maintaining the dignified appearance Harold had insisted upon despite the strategic blow they had been dealt with the railroad announcement. On the journey back to the ranch, Harold outlined their situation with characteristic clarity. "Victor has been planning this for months. The railroad spur is perfect leverage, who can publicly oppose progress and prosperity." His expression was grim in the moonlight filtering into the carriage. "We need to develop a counter-strategy immediately." "Could we propose an alternative route for the spur?" Daisy suggested. "One that doesn't cross our property but still serves the town's interests." "Possibly, though the terrain makes our land the most direct path," Harold considered thoughtfully. "We need more information about the actual plans, not just Victor's public announcement." "I may be able to help with that," Zeke offered. "There are survey markers that must be placed for any legitimate railroad project. Finding them would give us the actual proposed route." Harold nodded appreciatively. "Good thinking, Harrington. Start tomorrow, but be discreet. We don't want to appear obstructionist." As they reached the ranch, the practical discussion of tactics and responses helped settle the heightened emotions of the evening. Yet when Zeke assisted Daisy from the carriage, the brief touch of their hands carried an awareness that had nothing to do with railroad spurs or territorial politics. "Thank you for your support today," she said quietly as her father moved ahead toward the house. "It meant more than you know." "I meant what I said," Zeke replied, holding her gaze in the moonlight, "about expectations and finding something better." A smile touched her lips, genuine and unguarded. "So did I," she hesitated, then added softly, "Good night, Zeke." It was the first time she had used his given name, the simple intimacy more significant than any formal declaration. "Good night, Daisy," he responded, the exchange marking another small but meaningful shift in their relationship. As he walked toward his cabin, Zeke realized how completely his perspective had changed since arriving at the Valerian Ranch. The solitary future he had planned now seemed hollow compared to the sense of purpose and connection he had found here. The ranch's struggles had become his own, its people, particularly its remarkable daughter, matters of personal concern rather than temporary association. The transformation should have alarmed him, contradicting as it did his long-held belief that attachment invited only pain. Yet as he prepared for bed that night, Zeke felt something he had not experienced in years, a sense of rightness, of belonging exactly where he was meant to be. The frontier had always been a place of danger and uncertainty. But perhaps it could also be a place of second chances and new beginnings, if a man was brave enough to reach for them. The railroad survey markers proved difficult to locate, concealed as they were among the rugged terrain of the foothills. Zeke spent 3 days searching the likely routes between Clearwater and the main line 40 miles south, looking for the small metal stakes and ribbon markers that would indicate the proposed path. On the 4th day he found them, a line of survey points cutting diagonally across the southeastern section of Valerian land, precisely where Silver Creek emerged from the foothills before flowing through the heart of the ranch. The strategic implications were immediately clear. The proposed route would not only claim a valuable section of Valerian property, but potentially compromise their water rights to the creek itself. He reported his findings to Harold and Daisy that evening in the main house study, where maps of the ranch and surrounding territory were spread across a large oak table. "They've chosen the worst possible route for us," Harold observed grimly, tracing the line Zeke had marked on the map. "It divides our best grazing land and threatens our primary water source." "It can't be coincidental," Daisy added, studying the proposed path. "There are at least 2 alternative routes that would reach Clearwater almost as directly, without crossing our property at all." "But those alternatives would require Hoffman land," Zeke pointed out. "Victor has orchestrated this perfectly. The route serves the railroad's interests for directness while primarily impacting Valerian holdings rather than Hoffman property." Harold straightened, his expression hardening with resolve. "We need legal counsel. I'll ride to Cheyenne next week to consult with Judge Brannon. He's an old friend and knows territorial law better than anyone." "What about more immediate actions?" Daisy asked. "The survey markers are already in place. Construction preparation could begin before legal remedies are available." "We monitor but don't interfere," Harold decided after a moment's consideration. "Any direct opposition would play into the Hoffman's narrative of us obstructing progress." He turned to Zeke. "Arrange regular patrols of the boundary line and survey route, but instruct the men to observe only. No confrontations." Zeke nodded, respecting the strategic approach. Harold Valerian was proving to be a more formidable opponent than the Hoffmans had likely anticipated when they formulated their plan. His years of withdrawal had been interpreted as weakness, but the rancher was demonstrating a shrewd tactical mind now that he had fully engaged with the threat. As the meeting concluded, Harold retired to write correspondence to his legal contacts, leaving Zeke and Daisy alone in the study. They stood before the map, shoulders nearly touching as they examined the marked route. "He's different," Daisy observed quietly. "My father, since you came to the ranch, more present." "He was never truly absent," Zeke replied. "Just wounded in ways that weren't visible." She glanced at him, surprise evident in her expression. "That's exactly it. How did you know?" Zeke considered his response carefully. "I recognized something familiar in him. When you lose someone who defines your world, it's easier sometimes to retreat than to rebuild." Understanding dawned in her green eyes. "Your sister." He nodded, uncomfortable with the personal admission but unwilling to dismiss her perception. "And others during the war, there were. Losses that changed how I saw the world." "Is that why you were drifting when you came here, avoiding new connections?" Her insight was unsettlingly accurate. It seemed safer that way. And now she turned to face him fully, the directness of her gaze making evasion impossible. Zeke met her eyes, aware they had reached a critical juncture in their relationship. "Now I'm beginning to think safety might be overrated compared to what's gained by taking risks." The honesty of his response hung between them, more revealing than any formal declaration. Daisy's expression softened, a vulnerability rarely displayed emerging briefly before her practical nature reasserted itself. "We should both get some rest," she said, though her tone suggested reluctance to end their conversation. Tomorrow brings more challenges, no doubt. As they walked together from the house toward their separate dwellings, their hands brushed briefly in the darkness. Neither acknowledged the contact, yet neither pulled away, the momentary connection symbolizing the gradual dissolution of the careful distance they had maintained. At the point where their paths diverged, Daisy paused. "Zeke," she said softly, the use of his first name still new enough to carry significance, "thank you for finding another way to stand with us." Not everyone would have committed themselves to a fight that wasn't originally theirs. "It became mine the moment I gave my word," he replied. Then, with a courage that had nothing to do with physical danger, he added more quietly, and perhaps even before that. Her smile in the moonlight held a warmth that followed him back to his cabin, where sleep came easier than it had in years despite the complications facing the ranch. The future remained uncertain, fraught with conflict and potential loss. Yet for the first time since the war, Zeke found himself looking forward rather than back, imagining possibilities rather than calculating escape routes. It was a profound shift for a man who had spent so long defending against hope rather than embracing it. That the change had occurred amid a territorial feud over land and water rights seemed fitting somehow. The frontier had always been a place where men discovered their true nature in the crucible of conflict and hardship. For Zeke Harrington, that discovery was increasingly clear. He had found something on the Valerian Ranch worth fighting for, not just the land or its people, but a future he had stopped believing was possible for a man with his history. And that realization, more than any tactical consideration, made the coming struggle with the Hoffmans deeply personal. The following weeks brought escalating tension between the ranches. Harold Valerian's journey to Cheyenne yielded mixed results. Legal challenges to the railroad route were possible, but would take time to adjudicate, with no guarantee of success given the territorial government's strong interest in railroad development. Meanwhile, the Hoffman faction increased pressure through other channels. Loans from the Peterson Bank suddenly required additional collateral from Valerian-allied businesses in town. The Clearwater Chronicle published a series of articles extolling the economic benefits of the railroad spur, pointedly noting that certain large landholders might place private interests above community prosperity. Through it all, the Valerians maintained their dignified resistance, neither publicly opposing the railroad nor conceding their rights. Zeke established regular patrols of the boundary and survey line, ensuring no encroachments occurred while avoiding direct confrontation with Hoffman riders, conducting similar surveillance from their side. The uneasy stalemate shattered on a crisp autumn morning when Cooper rode hard into the ranch yard, his horse lathered from exertion. Zeke was reviewing cattle tallies with Johnson when the commotion brought them both hurrying from the barn. "Railroad men," Cooper reported breathlessly as he dismounted. "A dozen of them with equipment moving onto our land by the South Survey markers. Victor Hoffman's with them, acting like some kind of official guide." Zeke's expression hardened. "Are they actually beginning construction?" "Clearing brush, marking trees for removal. Looks like preparation work." Cooper accepted the canteen Johnson offered. "They've got papers they claim authorize the work, signed by Judge Wilson and the Territorial Commission." "Where's Miss Valerian?" Zeke asked, already moving toward the main house. "Riding the north pasture with her father," Johnson answered. "Checking the herd they're planning to drive to market next week." Zeke made a quick decision. "Johnson, send someone to inform Mr. Valerian and Miss Daisy immediately." "Cooper, gather 4 men, steady ones, no hotheads, and meet me at the stable in 10 minutes. We're riding out to assess the situation." Within the promised time, they were mounted and heading toward the southern boundary at a controlled gallop. As they rode, Zeke outlined his expectations clearly. "We observe only. No weapons drawn unless directly threatened. Our purpose is to establish the exact nature of their activity and document any encroachment." "Is that understood?" The men nodded, recognizing the delicate balance required. Direct confrontation could escalate into violence that would only harm the Valerian position, regardless of who fired first. Yet allowing unchallenged incursion onto their land would set a dangerous precedent. They approached the survey line cautiously, the sounds of men working becoming audible before they crested the final rise overlooking the site. Below, in a small clearing near Silver Creek, a work crew was indeed clearing brush and marking trees along the survey route. Heavy equipment, plows, and earth-moving tools waited on wagons nearby. Victor Hoffman stood conversing with a man in a formal suit who appeared to be directing the operation, gesturing expansively toward the creek and the land beyond. Zeke signaled for the Valerian riders to halt at a distance that was observable but not immediately threatening. After a few minutes, their presence was noted, prompting Victor to break away from his conversation and ride up the slope toward them, two Hoffman hands following at a discreet distance. Harrington, Victor acknowledged with false cordiality as he reached them. Come to witness progress firsthand, very commendable. We're here to understand why railroad workers are operating on Valerian land without prior notification or permission, Zeke replied evenly. Victor produced a folded document from his coat pocket. Everything is perfectly legal. The Territorial Commission has approved preliminary work on the railroad spur, with full authority to access necessary lands for survey and preparation. His smile never reached his cold eyes. Judge Wilson signed the order himself 3 days ago. Zeke accepted the document, scanning its contents quickly. The authorization appeared genuine, though carefully worded to avoid explicit mention of construction, focusing instead on necessary preparatory activities along the approved route. This grants access for survey work and preliminary assessment, Zeke observed, handing the paper back. Not brush clearing or tree removal. Those activities constitute material alteration of private property. Victor's expression hardened slightly. The Commission's authority extends to all necessary preparations for approved railroad development. Your legal interpretation is irrelevant. That will be for the courts to decide, Zeke responded calmly. Until then, I must ask that your workers confine themselves to observation and measurement only, not physical alteration of Valerian land. Or what, Harrington? Victor's pretense of civility dropped entirely. Will you and your handful of cowboys attempt to remove a dozen railroad workers and their Territorial Commission authorization? That would make for interesting headlines in the Chronicle. The calculated provocation was obvious. Victor hoped to maneuver the Valerians into actions that could be portrayed as violent opposition to progress. Zeke refused to take the bait. We're simply establishing the facts of the current activity for Mr. Valerian's legal representatives, he replied evenly. Any actions beyond documentation will be his decision, in consultation with the proper authorities. Frustration flickered across Victor's features at being denied the confrontation he sought. Your employer is fighting a losing battle, Harrington. This railroad is coming through, whether the Valerians like it or not. Smart men are choosing the winning side. Interesting, Zeke observed mildly. I've usually found that men who need to announce their winning are rarely as confident as they pretend to be. Color rose in Victor's face at the subtle challenge. Before he could respond, however, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Harold and Daisy Valerian appeared on the ridge above, having evidently ridden directly from the north pasture upon receiving Johnson's message. They made their way down to the assembled group, Harold's expression grim as he surveyed the activity below. Daisy's green eyes flashed with barely contained anger when she noted the cleared brush and marked trees along the creek bank. Mr. Hoffman, Harold greeted Victor with frigid formality. I see you've taken considerable liberties with Valerian property. Victor straightened in his saddle. Mr. Valerian, your man Harrington has been informed of our proper authorization. Perhaps he can explain the situation to you. The patronizing tone made clear his disdain for Harold's recent absence from active ranch management. I'm fully aware of the situation, Harold replied, his cultured voice carrying quiet authority. The Territorial Commission may authorize survey access, but material alteration of private property requires either owner consent or formal condemnation proceedings with appropriate compensation. He gestured toward the work site. Neither has occurred. Legal technicalities, Victor dismissed. The railroad is coming, Valerian. Fighting it only damages your standing in the community and delays the inevitable. Perhaps, Harold acknowledged with surprising mildness. But the law remains the law, even in the territory. Your workers will cease all clearing activities on Valerian land immediately, or I will file for an emergency injunction with the territorial court in Cheyenne tomorrow. Victor's confidence wavered visibly. Harold Valerian's calm legal approach was clearly not the reaction he had anticipated. After a moment's consideration, he nodded curtly. I'll consult with the railroad representative. But this is a temporary setback at best. As he turned his horse to ride back to the worksite, Daisy spoke for the first time, her voice carrying clearly in the autumn air. Mr. Hoffman, please convey our congratulations to your fiancée. We noticed she wasn't with you at church on Sunday. I hope she's not unwell. The seemingly innocent inquiry carried a subtle barb that didn't escape Victor's notice. Margaret Peterson had indeed been conspicuously absent from recent public gatherings, prompting speculation about the state of the engagement that formed a cornerstone of the Hoffman-Peterson alliance. Miss Peterson is in excellent health, thank you, Victor replied stiffly. She's currently visiting relatives in Denver. With that, he rode down to confer with the railroad representative, leaving the Valerians and their hands on the ridge. Within 30 minutes, the workers began packing their equipment, though the railroad man could be seen gesturing emphatically during what appeared to be a heated discussion with Victor. A temporary victory at best, Harold observed as they watched the work crew depart, but it gives us time to file the proper legal challenges. They'll be back, Daisy added, her expression troubled. With more explicit authorization, most likely. Yes, but forcing them to follow proper procedures buys us time and establishes our commitment to legal remedies rather than frontier justice. Harold turned to Zeke. Well handled, Harrington. Your restraint today prevented exactly the confrontation Victor was hoping to provoke. Thank you, sir. Zeke glanced toward the departing Hoffman riders, but I agree with Miss Valerian. They'll try again, perhaps more aggressively next time. Harold nodded grimly, which is why I'll be leaving for Cheyenne tomorrow to file our injunction and meet with the governor if possible. This has moved beyond local politics into territorial affairs. He turned to his daughter. Daisy, you and Harrington will need to manage things here while I'm gone. The cattle drive to market can't be delayed any longer. We need the proceeds to fund our legal battle. We'll handle it, Daisy assured him, exchanging a brief glance with Zeke that conveyed shared resolve. As they rode back to the ranch, Zeke found himself reflecting on the day's events. The conflict with the Hoffmans had entered a new phase, less overtly violent but potentially more dangerous, as it now involved territorial politics and corporate interests far beyond the original water rights dispute. Yet despite the escalating stakes, he felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity. The complexities of territorial law and railroad politics were new challenges, but the essential truth remained unchanged. He had committed himself to standing with the Valerians, and that commitment now extended far beyond his formal agreement with Harold. Riding beside Daisy as the autumn sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming landscape, Zeke acknowledged the transformation that had occurred within him since arriving at the ranch. The man who had drifted into Clearwater Valley believing connection was a liability had found something he hadn't known he was seeking, not just purpose or belonging, but the particular strength that came from fighting for something greater than oneself. And at the heart of that transformation was the remarkable woman whose quiet courage and fierce love for her land had gradually dismantled the walls he had built around his heart. Whatever challenges the Hoffmans and their railroad allies might bring, Zeke knew with increasing certainty that he would face them not just as the Valerians' representative, but as a man who had found something worth defending at any cost. Harold Valerian's departure for Cheyenne coincided with final preparations for the cattle drive to the railroad junction at Powder Creek, 60 miles east. The drive represented a significant portion of the ranch's annual income, nearly 300 head of prime beef cattle bound for eastern markets, their sale essential for the Valerian financial position. With Harold gone, responsibility for both the ranch's defense and the critical drive fell to Daisy and Zeke. After careful consideration, they divided duties.